Chapter 31 of Saint Elmo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Saint Elmo by Augusta Jane Evans. Chapter 31. The Greek myth concerning Demophoon embodies a valuable truth which the literary career of Edna Earle was destined to exemplify. Harsh critics, like disguised series, plunged the young author into the flames, and fortunately for her, as no short-sighted, loving Matanera snatched her from the fiery ordeal, she ultimately obtained the boon of immortality. Her regular contributions to the magazine enhanced her reputation and broadened the sphere of her influence. Profoundly impressed by the conviction that she held her talent in trust, she worked steadily, looking neither to the right nor left, but keeping her eyes fixed upon that day when she should be called to render an account to him who would demand his own with interest. Instead of becoming flushed with success, she grew daily more cautious, more timid, lest inadvertence or haste should betray her into errors. Consequently, as the months rolled away, each magazine article seemed an improvement on the last, and lifted her higher in public favor. The blacksmith's grandchild had become a power in society. Feeling that a recluse life would give her only partial glimpses of that humanity which she wished to study, she moved in the circle of cultivated friends who now eagerly stretched out their arms to receive her. And keeping herself unspotted from the world, she earnestly scrutinized social leprosy and calmly watched the tendency of American thought and feeling. Among philosophic minds, she saw an inclination to ignore the principles of such systems as Sir William Hamilton's, and to embrace the modified and subtle materialism of Buckle and Mill, or the gross atheism of Buchner and Moleschott. Positivism in philosophy and pre-Raphaelitism in art confronted her in the ranks of the literary. Lofty idealism seemed trodden down, pawed over by Carlyle's monster utilitaria. When she turned to the next social stratum, she found altars of Mammon groves of Baal, shining show dagons set up by business men and women of fashion. Society appeared intent only upon reviving the offering to propitiate evil spirits, and sometimes it seemed thickly sprinkled with very thinly disguised refugee Yezidis, who in the East openly worshipped the devil. Statesmen were almost extinct. In America, a mere corporal's guard remained, battling desperately to save the stabbed Constitution from howling demagogues and fanatics, who raved and ranted where Washington, Webster, and Calhoun had once swayed a free and happy people. The old venerated barriers and well-guarded outposts which decorum and true womanly modesty had erected on the frontiers of propriety were swept away in the crevasse of sans-souci manners that threatened to inundate the entire land, and latitudinarianism in dress and conversation was rapidly reducing the sexes to an equality dangerous to morals and subversive of all chivalric respect for woman. A double-faced idol, fashion and flirtation, engrossed the homage of the majority of females, while a few misguided ones, weary of the inanity of the mass of womanhood, and desiring to effect a reform, mistook the sources of the evil, and rushing to the opposite extreme, demanded power, which as a privilege they already possessed, but as a right could not extort. A casual glance at the surface of society seemed to justify Burke's conclusion that this earth is the bedlam of our system. But Edna looked deeper and found much that encouraged her. much that warmed and bound her sympathies to her fellow creatures. Instead of following the beaten track, she struck out a new path, and tried the plan of denouncing the offence, not the offender, of attacking the sin while she pitied the sinner. Ruthlessly she assaulted the darling follies, the pet, velvet-masked vices that society had adopted, and called the reading world to a friendly parley, demanding that men and women should pause and reflect in their mad career, because she was earnest and not bitter, because the white banner of Christian charity floated over the conference ground, because she showed so clearly that she loved the race whose recklessness grieved her, because her rebukes were free from scorn and written rather in tears than gall, people turned their heads and stopped to listen. So it came to pass that finally, after toiling over many obstacles, she reached the vine-clad valley of Eschol. Each day brought her noble fruitage, as letters came from all regions of the country asking for advice and assistance in little trials of which the world knew nothing. Over the young of her own sex she held a singular sway, and orphan girls of all ranks and ages wrote of their respective sorrows and difficulties, and requested her kind counsel. To these her womanly heart turned yearningly, and she accepted their affectionate confidence as an indication of her proper circle of useful labor. Believing that the intelligent, refined, modest Christian women of the United States were the real custodians of national purity, and the sole agents who could successfully arrest the tide of demoralization breaking over the land, she addressed herself to the wives, mothers, and daughters of America, calling upon them to smite their false gods and purify the shrines at which they worshipped. Jealously she contended for every woman's right which God and nature had decreed the sex, the right to be learned, wise, noble, useful, in woman's divinely limited sphere, the right to influence and exalt the circle in which she moved, the right to mount the sanctified bema of her own quiet hearthstone, the right to modify and direct her husband's opinions if he considered her worthy and competent to guide him, the right to make her children ornaments to their nation and a crown of glory to their race, the right to advise, to plead, to pray, the right to make her desk a Delphi, if God so permitted, the right to be all that the phrase noble Christian woman means, but not the right to vote, to harangue from the hustings, to trail her heaven-born purity through the dust and mire of political strife, to ascend the rasta of statesmen, whither she may send a worthy husband, son or brother, but whither she can never go without disgracing all womanhood. Edna was conscious of the influence she exerted, and ceaselessly she prayed that she might wield it aright. While aware of the prejudice that exists against literary women, she endeavored to avoid the outre idiosyncrasies that justly render so many of that class unpopular and ridiculous. She felt that she was a target at which observers aimed random shafts, and while devoting herself to study, she endeavored to give due attention to the rules of etiquette and the harmonious laws of the toilette. The friendship between Mr. Manning and herself strengthened, as each learned more fully the character of the other, and an affectionate, confiding frankness marked their intercourse. As her popularity increased, she turned to him more frequently for advice, for success only rendered her cautious, and day by day she weighed more carefully all that fell from her pen, dreading lest some error should creep into her writings and lead others astray. In her publisher, an honorable, kind-hearted, and generous gentleman, she found a valued friend, and as her book sold extensively, the hope of a competency was realized, and she was soon relieved from the necessity of teaching. She was a pet with the reading public. It became fashionable to lionize her. Her pictures and autographs were eagerly sought after, and the little barefooted Tennessee child had grown up to celebrity. Sometimes when a basket of flowers, or a handsome book, or a letter of thanks and cordial praise was received from an unknown reader, the young author was so overwhelmed with grateful appreciation of these little tokens of kindness and affection that she wept over them, or prayed tremulously that she might make herself more worthy of the good opinion entertained of her by strangers. Mr. Manning, whose cold, searching eye was ever upon her, could detect no exultation in her manner. She was earnestly grateful for every kind word uttered by her friends and admirers, for every favourable sentence penned about her writings, but she seemed only gravely glad, and was as little changed by praise as she had been by severe animadversion. The sweet, patient expression still rested on her face, and her beautiful eyes beamed with the steady light of resignation rather than the starry sparkle of extravagant joy. Sometimes, when the editor missed her at the literary reunions, where her presence always contributed largely to the enjoyment of the evening, and sought her in the schoolroom, he was often surprised to find her seated beside Felix, reading to him or listening to his conversation with a degree of interest which she did not always offer to the celebrities who visited her. Her power over the cripple was boundless. His character was as clay in her hands, and she was faithfully striving to model a noble, hallowed life, for she believed that he was destined to achieve distinction, and fondly hoped to stamp upon his mind principles and aims that would fructify abundantly when she was silent in the grave. Mrs. Andrews often told her that she was the only person who had ever controlled or influenced the boy, that she could make him just what she pleased, and she devoted herself to him, resolved to spare no toil in her efforts to correct the evil tendencies of his strong, obstinate, stormy nature. His fondness for history and for all that involves theories of government led his governess to hope that at some future day he might recruit the depleted ranks of statesmen, that he might reflect lustre upon his country, and with this trust spurring her ever on, she became more and more absorbed in her schemes for developing his intellect and sanctifying his heart. People wondered how the lovely woman, whom society flattered and feted, could voluntarily shut herself up in a schoolroom, and few understood the sympathy which bound her so firmly to the broad-browed, sallow little cripple. One December day, several months after their return from the seaside, Edna and Felix sat in the library. The boy had just completed Prescott's Philip II, and the governess had promised to read to him Schiller's Don Carlos and Goethe's Egmont in order to impress upon his memory the great actors of the Netherland Revolution. She took up the copy of Don Carlos, and crossing his arms on the top of his crutches, as was his habit, the pupil fixed his eyes on her face. The reading had continued probably a half-hour when Felix heard a whisper at the door, and looking over his shoulder saw a stranger standing on the threshold. He rose. The movement attracted the attention of the governess, and as she looked up, a cry of joy rang through the room. She dropped the book and sprang forward with open arms. "Oh, Mrs. Murray, dear friend!" For some moments they stood locked in a warm embrace, and as Felix limped out of the room he heard his governess sobbing. Mrs. Murray held the girl at arm's length, and as she looked at the wan, thin face, she exclaimed, "My poor Edna, my dear little girl, why did not you tell me you were ill? You are a mere ghost of your former self. My child, why did you not come home long ago? I should have been here a month earlier, but was detained by Estelle's marriage." Edna looked vacantly at her benefactress, and her lips whitened as she asked, "Did you say Estelle was married?" "Yes, my dear. She is now in New York with her husband. They are going to Paris." "She married your—" The head fell forward on Mrs. Murray's bosom, and, as in a dream, she heard the answer. "Estelle married that young Frenchman, Victor de Saint-Cyr, whom she met in Europe. Edna, what is the matter, my child?" She found that she could not rouse her, and in great alarm called for assistance. Mrs. Andrews promptly resorted to the remedies advised by Dr. Howe, but it was long before Edna fully recovered, and then she lay with her eyes closed and her hands clasped across her forehead. Mrs. Murray sat beside the sofa weeping silently, while Mrs. Andrews briefly acquainted her with the circumstances attending former attacks. When the latter was summoned from the room and all was quiet, Edna looked up at Mrs. Murray, and tears rolled over her cheeks as she said, "I was so glad to see you. The great joy and the surprise overcame me. I'm not as strong as I used to be in the old happy days at Le Bocage, but after a little I shall be myself. It is only occasionally that I have these attacks of faintness, Put your hand on my forehead as you did years ago, and let me think that I am a little child again. Oh, the unspeakable happiness of being with you once more. Hush, do not talk now. You are not strong enough. Mrs. Murray kissed her and tenderly smoothed the hair back from her blue-veined temples, where the blood still fluttered irregularly. For some minutes the girl's eyes wandered eagerly over her companion's countenance, tracing there the outlines of another and far dearer face, and finding a resemblance between mother and son, which she had never noticed before. Then she closed her eyes again, and a half-smile curved her trembling mouth, for the voice and the touch of the hand seemed indeed Mr. Murray's. "Edna, I shall never forgive you for not writing to me, telling me frankly of your failing health. Oh, scold me as much as you please. It is a luxury to hear your voice, even in reproof. I knew mischief would come of this separation from me. You belong to me, and I mean to have my own, and take proper care of you in future. The idea of your working yourself to a skeleton for the amusement of those who care nothing about you is simply preposterous, and I intend to put an end to such nonsense. Mrs. Murray, why have you not mentioned Mr. Hammond? I almost dread to ask about him." "Because you do not deserve to hear from him. A grateful and affectionate pupil you have proved, to be sure. Oh, Edna, what has come over you, child? Are you so intoxicated with your triumphs that you utterly forget your old friends, who loved you when you were unknown to the world? At first I thought so. I believed that you were heartless, like all of your class, and completely wrapped up in ambitious schemes. But, my little darling, I see I wronged you. Your poor white face reproaches me for my injustice, and I feel that success has not spoiled you, that you are still my little Edna, my sweet child, my daughter. Be quiet now, and listen to me, and try to keep that flutter out of your lips. Mr. Hammond is no worse than he has been for many months, but he is very feeble, and cannot live much longer. You know very well that he loves you tenderly, and he says he cannot die in peace without seeing you once more. Every day when I go over to the parsonage, his first question is, 'Ellen, is she coming? Have you heard from her?' I wish you could have seen him when St. Elmo was reading your book to him. It was the copy you sent, and when we read aloud the joint dedication to him and to myself, the old man wept and asked for his glasses and tried to read it, but could not. Edna put out her hand with a mute gesture, which her friend well understood, and she paused and was silent, while the governess turned her face to the wall and wept softly, trying to compose herself. 10 minutes passed, and she said, "Please go on now, Mrs. Murray, and tell me all he said. You can have no idea how I've longed to know what you all at home thought of my little book. Oh, I've been so hungry for home praise. I sent the very earliest copies to you and to Mr. Hammond, and I thought it so hard that you never mentioned them at all. My dear, it was my fault, and I confess it freely. Mr. Hammond, of course, could not write, but he trusted me to thank you in his name for the book and the dedication. I was really angry with you for not coming home when I wrote for you, and I was jealous of your book and would not praise it because I knew you expected it. But because I was silent, do you suppose I was not proud of my little girl? If you could have seen the tears I shed over some of the eulogies pronounced upon you, and heard all the ugly words I could not avoid uttering against some of your critics, you could not doubt my thorough appreciation of your success. My dear, it is impossible to describe Mr. Hammond's delight as we read your novel to him. Often he would say, 'St. Elmo, read that passage again.' I knew she was a gifted child, but I did not expect that she would ever write such a book as this. When we read the last chapter, he was completely overcome, and said repeatedly, 'God bless my little Edna. It is a noble book. It will do good, much good.' To me it seems almost incredible that the popular author is the same little lame, crushed orphan whom I lifted from the grass at the railroad track 7 years ago." Edna had risen and was sitting on the edge of the sofa, with one hand supporting her cheek and a tender, glad smile shining over her features as she listened to the commendation of those dearer than all the world beside. Mrs. Murray watched her anxiously and sighed as she continued, "If ever a woman had a worshipper, you certainly possess one in Huldah Reed. It would be amusing, if it were not touching, to see her bending in ecstasy over everything you write, over every notice of you that meets her eye. She regards you as her model in all respects. You would be surprised at the rapidity with which she acquires knowledge. She is a pet of St. Elmo's, and repays his care and kindness with a devotion that makes people stare, For you know my son is regarded as an ogre, and the child's affection for him seems incomprehensible to those who only see the rough surface of his character. She never saw a frown on his face or heard a harsh word from him, for he is strangely tender in his treatment of the little thing. Sometimes it makes me start when I hear a merry laugh ringing through the house, for the sound carries me far back into the past, when my own children romped and shouted at Le Bocage. You were always a quiet, demure, and rather solemn child, but this Huldah is a gay little sprite. St. Elmo is so astonishingly patient with her that Estelle accuses him of being in his dotage. Oh, Edna, it would make you glad to see my son and that orphan child sitting together reading the Bible. Last week I found them in the library. She was fast asleep with her head on his knee, and he sat with his open Bible in his hand. He is so changed in his manner that you would scarcely know him, and oh, I am so happy and so grateful. I can never thank God sufficiently for the blessing." Mrs. Murray sobbed, and Edna bent her own head lower in her palms. For some seconds both were silent. Mrs. Murray seated herself close to the governess and clasped her arms around her. "Edna, why did you not tell me all? Why did you leave me to find out by accident that which should have been confided to me?" The girl trembled, and a fiery spot burned on her cheeks as she pressed her forehead against Mrs. Murray's bosom, and said hastily, "To what do you allude?" "Why did you not tell me that my son loved you, and wished to make you his wife? I never knew what passed between you until about a month ago, and then I learned it from Mr. Hammond. Although I wondered why St. Elmo went as far as Chattanooga with you on your way north, I did not suspect any special interest, for his manner betrayed none when, after his return, he merely said that he found no one on the train to whose care he could commit you. Now I know all, know why you left Le Bocage, and I know, too, that in God's hands you have been the instrument of bringing St. Elmo back to his duty, to his old noble self. Oh, Edna, my child, if you could know how I love and thank you, how I long to fold you in my arms, so, and call you my daughter, Edna Murray, St. Elmo's wife. Ah, how proud I shall be of my own daughter, when I took a little bruised, moaning, homespun-clad girl into my house. How little I dreamed that I was sheltering unawares the angel who was to bring back happiness to my son's heart and peace to my own." She lifted the burning face and kissed the quivering lips repeatedly. "Edna, my brave darling, how could you resist St. Elmo's pleading? How could you tear yourself away from him? Was it because you feared that I would not willingly receive you as a daughter? Do not shiver so. Answer me. Oh, do not ask me, Mrs. Murray. Spare me. This is a subject which I cannot discuss with you." "Why not, my child? Can you not trust the mother of the man you love?" Edna unwound the arms that clasped her, and rising, walked away to the mantelpiece. Leaning heavily against it, she stood for some time with her face averted, and beneath the veil of long floating hair, Mrs. Murray saw the slight figure sway to and fro, like a reed shaken by the breeze. "Edna, I must talk to you about a matter which alone brought me to New York. My son's happiness is dearer to me than my life, and I have come to plead with you for his sake, if not for your own, at least to—" "It is useless. Do not mention his name again. Oh, Mrs. Murray, I am feeble to-day. Spare me. Have mercy on my weakness." She put out her hand appealingly, but in vain. "One thing you must tell me. Why did you reject him?" "Because I could not respect his character." "Oh, forgive me. You forced me to say it. Because I knew that he was unworthy of any woman's confidence and affection." The mother's face flushed angrily, and she rose and threw her head back with the haughty defiance peculiar to her family. "Edna Earle, how dare you speak to me in such terms of my own son? There is not a woman on the face of the broad earth who ought not to feel honored by his preference. You might not be proud of his hand. What right have you to pronounce him unworthy of trust? Answer me." "The right to judge him from his own account of his past life. The history which he gave me condemns him. His crimes make me shrink from him." "Crimes? Take care, Edna. You must be beside yourself. My son is no criminal. He was unfortunate and rash, but his impetuosity was certainly pardonable under the circumstances." "All things are susceptible of palliation in a mother's partial eyes," answered the governess. St. Elmo fought a duel, and afterward carried on several flirtations with women who were weak enough to allow themselves to be trifled with. Moreover, I shall not deny that at one period of his life he was lamentably dissipated, but all that happened long ago, before you knew him. How many young gentlemen indulge in the same things, and are never even reprimanded by society, much less denounced as criminals. The world sanctions duelling and flirting, and you have no right to set your extremely rigid notions of propriety above the verdict of modern society. Custom justifies many things which you seem to hold in utter abhorrence. Take care that you do not find yourself playing the Pharisee on the street corners." Mrs. Murray walked up and down the room twice, then came to the hearth. "Well, Edna, I am waiting to hear you." "There is nothing that I can say which would not wound or displease you. Therefore, dear Mrs. Murray, I must be silent." "Retract the hasty words you uttered just now. They express more than you intended." "I cannot. I mean all I said. Offences against God's law, which you consider pardonable, and which the world winks at and permits, and even defends, I regard as grievous sins. I believe that every man who kills another in a duel deserves the curse of Cain, and should be shunned as a murderer. My conscience assures me that a man who can deliberately seek to gain a woman's heart merely to gratify his vanity, or to wreak his hate by holding her up to scorn, or trifling with the love which he has won, is unprincipled, and should be ostracized by every true woman. Were you the mother of Murray and Annie Hammond, do you think you could so easily forgive this murderer? Their father forgives and trusts my son, and you have no right to sit in judgment upon him. Do you suppose that you are holier than that white-haired saint whose crown of glory is waiting for him in heaven? Are you so much purer than Alan Hammond that you fear contamination from one to whom he clings? No, 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 you wrong me. If you could know how humble is my estimate of myself, you would not taunt me so cruelly. You would only pity me." The despairing agony in the orphan's voice touched Mrs. Murray's proud heart, and tears softened the indignant expression of her eyes as she looked at the feeble form before her. "Edna, my poor child, you must trust me. One thing I must know. I have a right to ask. Do you not love my son? You need not blush to acknowledge it to me." She waited a while, but there was no reply, and softly her arm stole around the girl's waist. "My daughter, you need not be ashamed of your affection for St. Elmo." Edna lifted her face from the mantle, and clasping her hands across her head, exclaimed, "Do I love him? Oh, none but God can ever know how entirely my heart is his. I have struggled against his fascination. Oh, indeed, I have wrestled and prayed against it. But today I do not deceive myself. I feel that I love him as I can never love any other human being. You are his mother, and you will pity me when I tell you that I fall asleep praying for him, that in my dreams I am with him once more, that the first thought on waking is still of him. What do you suppose it cost me to give him up? Oh, is it hard, think you, to live in the same world, and yet never look on his face, never hear his voice? God only knows how hard. If he were dead, I could bear it better. But to live with this great sea of silence between us, a dreary, cold, mocking sea, crossed by no word, no whisper, filled only with slowly, sadly sailing ghosts of precious memories. Yes, yes, despite all his unworthiness, despite the verdict of my judgment and the upbraiding of my conscience, I love him, I love him. You can sympathize with me. Do not reproach me. Pity me, oh, pity me in my feebleness." She put out her arms like a weary child and dropped her face on Mrs. Murray's shoulder. "My child, if you had seen him the night before I left home, you could not have resisted any longer the promptings of your own heart. He told me all that had ever passed between you, how he had watched and tempted you, how devotedly he loved you, how he reverenced your purity of character, how your influence, your example, had first called him back to his early faith. And then he covered his face and said, 'Mother, mother, if God would only give her to me, I would be a better man.' Edna, I feel as if my son's soul rested in your hands. If you throw him off utterly, he may grow desperate, and go back to his old habits of reckless dissipation and blasphemy. And if he should, oh, if he is lost at last, I will hold you accountable and charge you before God with his destruction. Edna, beware, you have a strange power over him. You can make him almost what you will. If you will not listen to your own suffering heart or to his love, hear me. Hear a mother pleading for her son's eternal safety." The haughty woman fell on her knees before the orphan and wept, and Edna instantly knelt beside her and clung to her. "I pray for him continually. My latest breath shall be a prayer for his salvation. His eternal welfare is almost as precious to me as my own. For if I get to heaven at last, do you suppose I could be happy even there without him? But, Mrs. Murray, I cannot be his wife. If he is indeed conscientiously striving to atone for his past life, he will be saved without my influence. and if his remorseful convictions of duty do not reform him, his affection for me would not accomplish it. Oh, of all mournful lots in life, I think mine is the saddest, to find it impossible to tear my heart from a man whom I distrust, whom I cannot honor, whose fascination I dread. I know my duty in this matter. My conscience leaves me no room to doubt, and from the resolution which I made in sight of Annie's grave, I must not swerve. I have confessed to you how completely my love belongs to him, how fruitless are my efforts to forget him. I have told you what bitter suffering our separation cost me, that you may know how useless it is for you to urge me. Ah, if I can withstand the wailing of my own lonely aching heart, there is nothing else that can draw me from the path of duty. No, no, not even your entreaties, dear Mrs. Murray, much as I love and owe you. God, who alone sees all, will help me to bear my loneliness. He only can comfort and sustain me, and in his own good time he will save Mr. Murray and send peace into his troubled soul. Until then, let us pray patiently. Flush and tremor had passed away. The features were locked in rigid whiteness, and the unhappy mother saw that further entreaty would indeed be fruitless. She rose and paced the floor for some moments. At last Edna said, "How long will you remain in New York?" 2 days, Edna. I came here against my son's advice, in opposition to his wishes, to intercede in his behalf, and to prevail on you to go home with me. He knew you better, it seems, than I did, for he predicted the result, and desired to save me from mortification. But I obstinately clung to the belief that you cherish some feeling of affectionate gratitude toward me. You have undeceived me. Mr. Hammond is eagerly expecting you, and it will be a keen disappointment to the old man if I return without you. Is it useless to tell you that you ought to go and see him? You need not hesitate on St. Elmo's account, for unless you wish to meet him, you will certainly not see him. My son is too proud to thrust himself into the presence of any one, much less into yours, Edna Earle. I will go with you, Mrs. Murray, and remain at the parsonage, at least for a few weeks. I scarcely think Mr. Hammond will live until spring, and it will make him very happy to have you in his home. Mrs. Murray wrapped her shawl around her and put on her gloves. I shall be engaged with Estelle while I am here, and shall not call again, but of course you will come to the hotel to see her, and we will start homeward day after tomorrow evening. She turned toward the door, but Edna caught her dress. Mrs. Murray, kiss me before you go, and tell me you forgive the sorrow I am obliged to cause you today. My burden is heavy enough without the weight of your displeasure. But the proud face did not relax. The mother shook her head, disengaged her dress, and left the room. An hour after, Felix came in, and approaching the sofa where his governess rested, said vehemently, "Is it true, Edna? Are you going south with Mrs. Murray?" "Yes, I am going to see a dear friend who is probably dying. Oh, Edna, what will become of me? I shall be absent only a few weeks. I have a horrible dread that if you go you will never come back. Don't leave me. Nobody needs you half as much as I do. Edna, you said once you would never forsake me. Remember your promise." "My dear little boy, I am not forsaking you. I shall only be separated from you for a month or two, and it is my duty to go to my sick friend. Do not look so wretched, for, just so surely as I live, I shall come back to you. You think so now, but your old friends will persuade you to stay, and you will forget me, and he turned around and hid his face on the back of his chair. It was in vain that she endeavored by promises and caresses to reconcile him to her temporary absence. He would not be comforted, and his tear-stained, woe-begone, sallow face, as she saw it on the evening of her departure, pursued her on her journey south. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of St. Elmo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. St. Elmo by Augusta Jane Evans. Chapter 32. The mockingbird sang, as of old, in the myrtle boughs that shaded the study window, and within the parsonage reigned the peaceful repose which seemed ever to rest like a benediction upon it. A ray of sunshine, stealing through the myrtle leaves, made golden ripples on the wall. A bright wood fire blazed in the wide, deep, old-fashioned chimney. The white cat slept on the rug, with her pink paws turned toward the crackling flames, and blue and white hyacinths hung their fragrant bells over the gilded edge of the vases on the mantelpiece. Huldah sat on one side of the hearth, peeling a red apple, and snugly wrapped in his palm-leaf cashmere dressing-gown, Mr. Hammond rested in his cushioned easy-chair, with his head thrown far back and his fingers clasping a large bunch of his favorite violets. His snowy hair drifted away from a face, thin and pale, but serene and happy, and in his bright blue eyes there was a humorous twinkle, and on his lips a half-smothered smile, as he listened to the witticisms of his Scotch countrymen in Noctis Ambrosianae. Close to his chair sat Edna, reading aloud from the quaint and inimitable book he loved so well, and pausing now and then to explain some word which Huldah did not understand, or to watch for symptoms of weariness in the countenance of the invalid. The three faces contrasted vividly in the ruddy glow of the fire, that of the little girl, round, rosy, red-lipped, dimpled, merry-eyed, the aged pastor's wrinkled cheeks and furrowed brow, and streaming silver beard, and the carved ivory features of the governess, borrowing no colour from the soft folds of her rich merino dress. As daylight ebbed, the ripple danced up to the ceiling and vanished, like the pricked bubble of a human hope. The mocking-bird hushed his vesper hymn, and Edna closed the book and replaced it on the shelf. Huldah tied on her scarlet-lined hood, kissed her friends good-bye, and went back to Le Bocage, and the old man and the orphan sat looking at the grotesque flicker of the flames on the burnished andirons. "Edna, are you tired, or can you sing some for me? Reading aloud rarely fatigues me. What shall I sing?" "That solemn, weird thing in the Prophet, which suits your voice so well." She sang "Ah, mon fils," and then, without waiting for the request which she knew would follow, gave him some of his favourite Scotch songs. As the last sweet strains of Mary of Argyle echoed through the study, the pastor shut his eyes, and memory flew back to the early years when his own wife Mary had sung those words in that room, and his dead darlings clustered eagerly around the piano to listen to their mother's music. 5 fair-browed, innocent young faces circling about the idolized wife, and baby Annie nestling in her cradle beside the hearth, playing with her waxen fingers and crowing softly. Death had stolen his household jewels, but recollection robbed the grave, and music's magic touch unsealed memory's golden urn. O death in life, the days that are no more! Edna thought he had fallen asleep, he was so still. His face was so placid, and she came softly back to her chair, and looked at the ruby temples and towers, the glittering domes and ash-gray ruined arcades built by the oak coals. A month had elapsed since her arrival at the parsonage, and during that short period Mr. Hammond had rallied and recovered his strength so unexpectedly that hopes were entertained of his entire restoration, and he spoke confidently of being able to re-enter his pulpit on Easter Sunday. The society of his favourite pupil seemed to render him completely happy, and his countenance shone in the blessed light that gladdened his heart. After a long, dark, stormy day, the sun of his life was preparing to set in cloudless peace and glory. Into all of Edna's literary schemes he entered eagerly. She read to him the manuscript of her new book as far as it was written, and was gratified by his perfect satisfaction with the style, plot, and aim. Mrs. Murray came every day to the parsonage, but Edna had not visited Le Bocage, and though Mr. Murray spent 2 mornings of each week with Mr. Hammond, he called at stated hours, and she had not yet met him. Twice she had heard his voice in earnest conversation, and several times she had seen his tall figure coming up the walk, but of his features she caught not even a glimpse. St. Elmo's name had never been mentioned in her presence by either his mother or the pastor, but Huldah talked ceaselessly of his kindness to her. Knowing the days on which he came to the parsonage, Edna always absented herself from the invalid's room until the visit was over. One afternoon she went to the church to play on the organ, and after an hour of mournful enjoyment in the gallery, so fraught with precious reminiscences, she left the church and found Tamerlane tied to the iron gate, but his master was not visible. She knew that he was somewhere in the building or yard, and denied herself the pleasure of going there a second time. Neither glance nor word had been exchanged since they parted at the railroad station 18 months before. She longed to know his opinion of her book, for many passages had been written with special reference to his perusal. But she would not ask, and it was a sore trial to sit in one room, hearing the low, indistinct murmur of his voice in the next, and yet never to see him. Few women could have withstood the temptation, but the orphan dreaded his singular power over her heart, and dared not trust herself in his presence. This evening, as she sat, with the firelight shining on her face, thinking of the past, she could not realize that only 2 years had elapsed since she came daily to this quiet room to recite her lessons, for during that time she had suffered so keenly in mind and body that it seemed as if weary ages had gone over her young head. Involuntarily she sighed and passed her hand across her forehead. A low tap at the door diverted her thoughts, and a servant entered and gave her a package of letters from New York. Every mail brought one from Felix, and now opening his first, a tender smile parted her lips as she read his passionate, importunate appeal for her speedy return, and saw that the closing lines were blotted with tears. The remaining 8 letters were from persons unknown to her, and contained requests for autographs and photographs, for short sketches for papers in different sections of the country, and also various inquiries concerning the time when her new book would probably be ready for press. All were kind, friendly, gratifying, and one was eloquent with thanks for the good effect produced by a magazine article on a dissipated, irreligious husband and father, who, after its perusal, had resolved to reform, and wished her to know the beneficial influence which she exerted. At the foot of the page was a line penned by the rejoicing wife, invoking heaven's choicest blessings on the author's head. Is not the laborer worthy of his hire? Edna felt that her wages were munificent indeed, that her coffers were filling, and though the thank God was not audible, the great joy in her uplifted eyes attracted the attention of the pastor, who had been silently watching her, and he laid his hands on hers. What is it, my dear? The reward God has given me. She read aloud the contents of the letter, and there was a brief silence, broken at last by Mr. Hammond. Edna, my child, are you really happy? So happy that I believe the wealth of California could not buy this sheet of paper which assures me that I have been instrumental in bringing sunshine to a darkened household, in calling the head of a family from haunts of vice and midnight orgies back to his wife and children, back to the shrine of prayer at his own hearthstone. I have not lived in vain, for through my work a human soul has been brought to Jesus, and I thank God that I am accounted worthy to labor in my Lord's vineyard. Oh, I will wear that happy wife's blessing in my inmost heart, and like those old bells in Cambridgeshire inscribed Pestum fungo sabata bongo, it shall ring a silvery chime, exorcising all gloom and loneliness and sorrow. The old man's eyes filled as he noted the radiance of the woman's lovely face. You have indeed cause for gratitude and great joy, as you realize all the good you are destined to accomplish, and I know the rapture of saving souls, for through God's grace I believe I have snatched some from the brink of ruin. But Edna, can the triumph of your genius, the applause of the world, the approval of conscience, even the assurance that you are laboring successfully for the cause of Christ, can all these things satisfy your womanly heart, your loving, tender heart? My child, there is a dreary look sometimes in your eyes that reveals loneliness, almost weariness of life. I have studied your countenance closely when it was in repose. I read it, I think, without terrors, and as often as I hear your writings praised, I recall those lines, written by one of the noblest of your own sex, to have our books appraised by love, associated with love, while we sit loveless. Is it hard, you think? At least 'tis mournful. Edna, are you perfectly contented with your lot? A shadow drifted slowly over the marble face, and though it settled on no feature, the whole countenance was changed. I cannot say that I am perfectly content, and yet I would not exchange places with any woman I know. Do you never regret a step which you took one evening yonder in my church? No, sir, I do not regret it. I often thank God that I was able to obey my conscience and take that step. Suppose that in struggling up the steep path of duty, one soul needs the encouragement, the cheering companionship which only one other human being can give. Will the latter be guiltless if the aid is obstinately withheld? Suppose the latter feels that in joining hands both would stumble? You would not, O Edna, you would lift each other to noble heights. Each life would be perfect, complete. My child, will you let me tell you some things that ought to— She threw up her hand with that old childish gesture which he remembered so well, and shook her head. No, sir, please tell me nothing that will rouse a sorrow I am striving to drug. Spare me, for as St. Chrysostom once said of Olympias the deaconess, I live in perpetual fellowship with pain. My dear little Edna, as I look at you and think of your future, I am troubled about you. I wish I could confidently say to you what that same St. Chrysostom wrote to Pentadea, for I know your great and lofty soul, which can sail as with a fair wind through many tempests, and in the midst of the waves enjoy a white calm. She turned and took the minister's hand in hers, while an indescribable peace settled on her countenance, and still the trembling of her low, sweet voice. Across the gray, stormy billows of life, that white calm of eternity is rimming the water line, coming to meet me. Already the black pilot boat heaves in sight. I hear the signal, and death will soon take the helm and steer my little bark safely into the shining rest, into God's white calm. She went to the piano and sang as a solo, Nights Shade No Longer, from Moses in Egypt. While the pastor listened, he murmured to himself, Sublime is the faith of a lonely soul, in pain and trouble cherished. Sublime is the spirit of hope that lives when earthly hope has perished. She turned over the sheets of music, hunting for a German hymn, of which Mr. Hammond was very fond, but he called her back to the fireplace. My dear, do you recollect that beautiful passage in Faber's Sights and Thoughts in Foreign Churches? There is seldom a line of glory written upon the earth's face, but a line of suffering runs parallel with it, and they that read the lustrous syllables of the one, and stoop not to decipher the spotted and worn inscription of the other, get the least half of the lesson earth has to give. No, sir, I never read the book. Something in that passage brings to my mind those words of Martin Luther's, which explain so many of the spotted inscriptions of this earth. Our Lord God doth like a printer who setteth the letters backward. We see and feel well his setting, but we shall read the print yonder in the life to come. Mr. Hammond, it is said that in the Alexandrian manuscript in the British Museum there is a word which has been subjected to microscopic examination to determine whether it is O-E, who, or the C blank, which is the abbreviation of T-O's. God, sometimes I think that so ought we to turn the lens of faith on many dim, perplexing inscriptions traced in human history, and perhaps we might oftener find God. Yes, I have frequently thought that the manuscript of every human life was like a Peruvian quipo, a mass of many-colored cords or threads, tied and knotted by unseen and possibly angel hands. Here, my dear, put these violets in water. They are withering. By the way, Edna, I am glad to find that in your writings you attach so much importance to the ministry of flowers, and that you call the attention of your readers to the beautiful arguments which they furnish in favor of the Christian philosophy of a divine design in nature. Truly, your voiceless lips, O flowers, are living preachers, each cup a pulpit and each leaf a book, supplying to my fancy numerous teachers from lowliest nook. At this moment the doorbell rang, and soon after the servant brought in a telegraphic dispatch addressed to Mr. Hammond. It was from Gordon Lee, announcing his arrival in New York, and stating that he and Gertrude would reach the parsonage sometime during the ensuing week. Edna went into the kitchen to superintend the preparation of the minister's supper, and when she returned and placed the waiter on the table near his chair, she told him that she must go back to New York immediately after the arrival of Gordon and Gertrude, as her services would no longer be required at the parsonage, and her pupils needed her. 2 days passed without any further allusion to the subject, which was evidently uppermost in Mr. Hammond's mind. On the morning of the 3rd, Mrs. Murray said, as she rose to conclude her visit, "You are so much better, sir, that I must claim Edna for a day at least. She has not yet been to Le Bocage, and as she goes away so soon, I want to take her home with me this morning. Clara Inge promised me that she would stay with you until evening. Edna, get your bonnet. I shall be entirely alone to-day, for St. Elmo has carried Huldah to the plantation, and they will not get home until late. So, my dear, we shall have the house all to ourselves." The orphan could not deny herself the happiness offered. She knew that she ought not to go, but for once her strength failed her. She yielded to the temptation. During the drive Mrs. Murray talked cheerfully of various things, and for the first time laid aside entirely the haughty constraint which had distinguished her manner since they travelled south from New York. They entered the avenue, and Edna gave herself up to the rushing recollections which were so mournfully sweet, and they went into the house, and the servants hurried forward to welcome her. She could not repress her tears. She felt that this was her home, her heart's home, and as numerous familiar objects met her eyes, Mrs. Murray saw that she was almost overpowered by her emotions. "I wonder if there is any other place on earth half so beautiful," murmured the governess several hours later, as they sat looking out over the lawn where the deer and sheep were browsing. "Certainly not to our partial eyes, and yet without you, my child, it does not seem like home. It is the only home where you will ever be happy." "Yes, I know it, but it cannot be mine, Mrs. Murray. I want to see my own little room." "Certainly you know the way. I will join you there presently. Nobody has occupied it since you left, for I feel toward your room as I once felt toward the empty cradle of my dead child." Edna went upstairs alone and closed the door of the apartment she had so long called hers, and looked with childish pleasure and affection at the rosewood furniture. Turning to the desk where she had written much that the world now praised and loved, she saw a vase containing a superb bouquet with a card attached by a strip of ribbon. The hothouse flowers were arranged with exquisite taste, and the orphan's cheeks glowed suddenly as she recognized Mr. Murray's handwriting on the card. For Edna Earle, when she took up the bouquet, a small envelope similarly addressed dropped out. For some minutes she stood irresolute, fearing to trust herself with the contents. Then she drew a chair to the desk, sat down, and broke the seal. "My darling, will you not permit me to see you before you leave the parsonage? Knowing the peculiar circumstances that brought you back, I cannot take advantage of them and thrust myself into your presence without your consent. I have left home to-day because I felt assured that, much as you might desire to see Le Bocage, you would never come here while there was a possibility of meeting me. You, who know something of my wayward, sinful, impatient temper, can perhaps imagine what I suffer when I am told that your health is wretched, that you are in the next room, and yet that I must not, shall not see you. My own Edna, do you wonder that I almost grow desperate at the thought that only a wall, a door, separates me from you, whom I love better than my life? Oh, my darling, allow me one more interview. Do not make my punishment heavier than I can bear. It is hard, it is bitter enough to know that you cannot or will not trust me. At least, let me see your dear face again. Grant me 1 hour. It may be the last we shall ever spend together in this world. Your own St. Elmo." Ah, my God, pity me. Why, oh, why is it that I am tantalized with glimpses of a great joy never to be mine in this life? Why, in struggling to do my duty, am I brought continually to the very gate of the only Eden I am ever to find in this world, and yet can never surprise the watching angel of wrath, and have to stand shivering outside and see my Eden only by the flashing of the sword that bars my entrance? Looking at the handwriting, so different from any other which she had ever examined, her thoughts were irresistibly carried back to that morning when, at the shop, she saw this handwriting for the first time on the blank leaf of the Dante, and she recalled the shuddering aversion with which her grandfather had glanced at it, and advised her to commit it to the flames of the forge. How many such notes as this had been penned to Annie and Gertrude, and to that wretched woman shut up in an Italian convent, and to others of whose names she was ignorant. Mrs. Murray opened the door, looked in, and said, "Come, I want to show you something really beautiful." Edna put the note in her pocket, took the bouquet, and followed her friend downstairs through the rotunda to the door of Mr. Murray's sitting room. "My son locked this door and carried the key with him, but after some search I have found another that will open it. Come in, Edna. Now look at that large painting hanging over the sarcophagus. It is a copy of Titian's Christ crowned with thorns, the original of which is in a Milan church, I believe. While St. Elmo was last abroad, he was in Genoa one afternoon when a boat was capsized. Being a fine swimmer, he sprang into the water, where several persons were struggling, and saved the lives of 2 little children of an English gentleman who had his hands quite full in rescuing his wife. 2 of the party were drowned, but the father was so grateful to my son that he has written him several letters, and last year he sent him this picture, which, though of course much smaller than the original, is considered a very fine copy. I begged to have it hung in the parlor, but fearing, I suppose, that its history might possibly be discovered, you know how he despises anything like a parade of good deeds, St. Elmo insisted on bringing it here to this Egyptian museum, where, unfortunately, people cannot see it. For some time they stood admiring it, and then Edna's eyes wandered away to the Taj Mahal, to the cabinets and bookcases. Her lip began to quiver, as every article of furniture babbled of the bygone, of the happy evenings spent here, of that hour when the idea of authorship first seized her mind and determined her future. Mrs. Murray walked up to the arch over which the curtains fell, touching the floor, and laying her hand on the folds of silk, said hesitatingly, "I'm going to show you something that my son will not easily forgive me for betraying, for it is a secret he guards most jealously. No, I would rather not see it. I wish to learn nothing which Mr. Murray is not willing that I should know. You will scarcely betray me to my son when you see what it is, and beside, I am determined you shall have no room to doubt the truth of some things he has told you. There is no reason why you should not look at it. Do you recognize that face yonder over the mantelpiece?" She held the curtains back, and despite her reluctance to glancing into the inner room, Edna raised her eyes timidly, and saw in a richly carved oval frame hanging on the opposite wall a life-size portrait of herself. We learn from the newspapers that some fine photographs had been taken in New York, and I sent on and bought 2. St. Elmo took one of them to an artist in Charleston, and superintended the painting of that portrait.
When he returned just before I went north, he brought the picture with him, and with his own hands hung it yonder. I've noticed that since that day he always keeps the curtains down over the arch, and never leaves the house without locking his rooms." Edna had dropped her crimson face in her hands, and Mrs. Murray raised it forcibly and kissed her. "I want you to know how well he loves you, how necessary you are to his happiness. Now I must leave you, for I see Mrs. Montgomery's carriage at the door. You have a note to answer. There are writing materials on the table yonder." She went out, closing the door softly, and Edna was alone with surroundings that pleaded piteously for the absent master. Oxalis and Heliotrope peeped at her over the top of the lotus vases. One of a pair of gauntlets had fallen on the carpet near the cameo cabinet. 2 or 3 newspapers and a meerschaum lay upon a chair. Several theological works were scattered on the sofa, and the air was heavy with lingering cigar smoke. Just in front of the Taj Mahal was a handsome copy of Edna's novel, and a beautiful morocco-bound volume containing a collection of all her magazine sketches. She sat down in the crimson cushioned armchair that was drawn close to the circular table where pen and paper told that the owner had recently been writing, and near the inkstand was a handkerchief with German initials SEN. Upon a mass of loose paper stood a quaint bronze paperweight representing Cartafides, the wandering Jew, and on the base was inscribed Mr. Murray's favorite Arabian maxim, "Ed dunya de jifatan ve tala baha kalabi," the world is an abomination, and those who toil about it are dogs. There, too, was her own little Bible, and as she took it up, it opened at the 14th chapter of St. John, where she found, as a bookmark, the photograph of herself from which the portrait had been painted. An unwithered geranium sprig lying among the leaves whispered that the pages had been read that morning. Out on the lawn, birds swung in the elm twigs, singing cheerily. Lambs bleated and ran races, and the little silver bell on Huldah's pet fawn, Edna, tinkled ceaselessly. "Help me, O my God, in this the last hour of my trial." The prayer went up meaningly, and Edna took a pen and turned to write. Her arm struck a portfolio lying on the edge of the table, and in falling loose sheets of paper fluttered out on the carpet. One caught her eye. She picked it up and found a sketch of the ivied ruins of File. Underneath the drawing, and dated 15 years before, were traced in St. Elmo's writing those lines which Henry Soame is said to have penned on the blank leaf of a copy of the Pleasures of Memory. Memory makes her influence known by sighs and tears and grief alone. I greet her as the fiend to whom belong the vulture's ravening beak, the raven's funereal song. She tells of time misspent, of comfort lost, of fair occasions gone for ever by, of hopes too fondly nursed, too rudely crossed, of many a cause to wish, yet fear to die. For what except the instinctive fear, lest she survive, detains me here, when all the life of life is fled? The lonely woman looked upward appealingly, and there upon the wall she met, not as formerly, the gleaming, augurous, inexorable eyes of the Cimbrian prophetess, but the pitying God's gaze of Titian's Jesus. When Mrs. Murray returned to the room, Edna sat as still as one of the mummies in the sarcophagus, with her head thrown back and the long black eyelashes sweeping her colourless cheeks. One hand was pressed over her heart, the other held a note directed to St. Elmo Murray, and the cold fixed features were so like those of an angel of death sometimes sculptured on cenotaphs that Mrs. Murray uttered a cry of alarm. As she bent over her, Edna opened her arms and said in a feeble, spent tone, "Take me back to the parsonage. I ought not to have come here. I might have known I was not strong enough. You have had one of those attacks. Why did you not call me? I will bring you some wine." "No, only let me go away as soon as possible. Oh, I am ashamed of my weakness." She rose, and her pale lips writhed as her sad eyes wandered in a farewell glance around the room. She put the unsealed note in Mrs. Murray's hand and turned toward the door. "Edna, my daughter, you have not refused St. Elmo's request. My mother, pity me, I could not grant it." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of St. Elmo. This as a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. St. Elmo by Augusta Jane Evans. Chapter 33. They have come. I hear Gertrude's birdish voice. The words had scarcely passed Mr. Hammond's lips ere his niece bounded into the room, followed by her husband.
Edna was sitting on the chintz-covered lounge, mending a basketful of the old man's clothes that needed numerous stitches and buttons, and throwing aside her sewing materials, she rose to meet the travellers. At sight of her, Gordon Lee stopped suddenly, and his face grew instantly as bloodless as her own. Edna, oh, how changed! What a wreck! He grasped her outstretched hand, folded it in his, which trembled violently, and a look of anguish mastered his features as his eyes searched her calm countenance. "I did not think it would come so soon, passing away in the early morning of your life. Oh, my pure, broken lily!" He did not seem to heed his wife's presence until she threw her arms around Edna, exclaiming, "Get away, Gordon. I want her all to myself. Why, you pale darling, what a starved ghost you are! Not half as substantial as my shadow, is she, Gordon? Oh, Edna, how I have longed to see you, to tell you how I enjoyed your dear, delightful, grand, noble book, to tell you what a great woman I think you are, and how proud of you I am. A gentleman who came over in the steamer with us asked me how much you paid me per annum to puff you. He was a miserable old cynic of a bachelor, ridiculed all women unmercifully, and at last I told him I would bet both my ears that the reason he was so bearish and hateful was because some pretty girl had flirted with him outrageously. He turned up his ugly nose, especially at blue stockings, said all literary women were hopeless pedants and slatterns, and quoted that abominable Horace Walpole's account of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu's dirt and vivacity. I really thought Gordon would throw him overboard. I wonder what he would say if he could see you darning Uncle Alan's socks. Oh, Edna, dearie, I am sorry to find you looking so pale." All this was uttered interjectionally, between vigorous hugs and warm, tender kisses, and as Gertrude threw her bonnet and wrappings on the lounge, she continued, "I wished for you just exactly 10,000 times while I was abroad. There were so many things that you could have described so beautifully. Gordon, don't Edna's eyes remind you very much of that divine picture of the Madonna at Dresden?" She looked round for an answer, but her husband had left the room, and recollecting a parcel that had been stowed away in the pocket of the carriage, she ran out to get it. Presently she reappeared at the door with a goblet in her hand. "Uncle Alan, who carries the keys now?" "Edna, what will you have, my dear?" "I want some brandy. Gordon looks very pale, and complains of not feeling well, so I intend to make him a mint julep. Ah, Edna, these husbands are such troublesome creatures." She left the room, jingling the bunch of keys, and a few moments after they heard her humming an air from Rigoletto as she bent over the mint bed under the study window. Mr. Hammond, who had observed all that passed and saw the earnest distress clouding the orphan's brow, said gravely, "She has not changed an iota. She never will be anything more than a beautiful married child, and is a mere pretty pet, not a companion in the true sense of the word. She is not quick-witted, or she would discern a melancholy truth that might overshadow all her life. Unless Gordon learns more self-control, he will ere long betray himself. I expostulated with him before his marriage, but for once he threw my warning to the winds. I am an old man, and have seen many phases of human nature, and watched the development of many characters, and I have found that these pique marriages are always mournful, always disastrous. In such instances I would with more pleasure officiate at the grave than at the altar. Once Estelle and Agnes persuaded me that St. Elmo was about to wreck himself on this rock of ruin, and even his mother's manner led me to believe that he would marry his cousin, but thank God he was wiser than I feared." "Mr. Hammond, are you sure that Gertrude loves Mr. Lee?" "Oh, yes, my dear. Of that fact there can be no doubt. Why do you question it?" "She told me once that Mr. Murray had won her heart." It was the first time Edna had mentioned his name since her return, and it brought a faint flush to her cheeks. That was a childish whim which she has utterly forgotten. A woman of her temperament never remains attached to a man from whom she is long separated. I do not suppose that she remembered St. Elmo a month after she ceased to meet him. I feel assured that she loves Gordon as well as she can love anyone.
She is a remarkably sweet-tempered, unselfish, gladsome woman, but is not capable of very deep, lasting feeling. I will go away at once. This is Saturday, and I will start to New York early Monday morning. Mr. Lee is weaker than I ever imagined he could be." The outline of her mouth hardened, and into her eyes crept an expression of scorn that very rarely found a harbor there. "Yes, my dear, although it grieves me to part with you, I know it is best that you should not be here, at least for the present. Agnes is visiting friends at the North, and when she returns, Gordon and Gertrude will remove to their new house. Then, Edna, if I feel that I need you, if I write for you, will you not come back to me? Dear child, I want your face to be the last I look upon in this world." She drew the pastor's shrunken hand to her lips and shook her head. "Do not ask me to do that which my strength will not permit. There are many reasons why I ought not to come here again, and moreover my work calls me hence to a distant field. My physical strength seems to be ebbing fast, and my vines are not all purple with mellow fruit. Some clusters, thank God, are fragrant, ripe, and ready for the wine-press when the angel of the vintage comes to gather them in. But my work is only half done. Not until my fingers clasp white flowers under a pall shall it be said of me, yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep. Incello quies. The German idea of death is to me peculiarly comforting and touching. Heimgang, going home. Ah, sir, humanity ought to be homesick, and in thinking of that mansion beyond the star-paved pathway of the sky, whither Jesus has gone to prepare our places, we children of earth should, like the Swiss, never lose our homesickness. Our bodies are of the dust, dusty, and bend dustward, but our souls floated down from the sardonyx walls of the everlasting city, and brought with them a yearning maladie du pays, which should help them to struggle back. Sometimes I am tempted to believe that the joys of this world are the true lotus, devouring which mankind glory in exile and forget the Heimgang. Oh, indeed, here we have no continuing city, but seek one to come. Heimgang, thank God, going home forever. The splendor of the large eyes seemed almost unearthly as she looked out over the fields, where in summers past the shout of the merry reapers rose like the songs of Greek harvesters to Demeter. Nay, nay, as a hymn of gratitude and praise to him who feedeth the fowls of the air, and maketh the universe a vast Sarepta, in which the cruse never faileth the prophets of God. Edna sat silent for some time with her slender hands folded on her lap, and the pastor heard her softly repeating, as if to her own soul, those lines on life. A cry between the silences, a shadow birth of clouds at strife, with sunshine on the hills of life, between the cradle and the shroud, a meteor's flight from cloud to cloud. Several hours later, when Mr. Lee returned to the study, he found Edna singing some of the minister's favorite Scotch ballads, while Gertrude rested on the lounge, half propped on her elbow, and leaning forward to dangle the cord and tassel of her robe de chambre, within reach of an energetic little blue-eyed kitten, which, with its paws in the air, rolled on the carpet, catching at the silken toy. The governess left the piano, and resumed her mending of the contents of the clothes basket. In answer to some inquiries of Mr. Hammond, Mr. Lee gave a brief account of his travels in southern Europe, but his manner was constrained, his thoughts evidently preoccupied. Once his eyes wandered to the round, rosy, dimpling face of his beautiful child wife, and he frowned, bit his lip, and sighed, while his gaze, earnest and mournfully anxious, returned and dwelt upon the weary but serene countenance of the orphan. In the conversation, which had turned accidentally upon philology and the manuscripts of the Vatican, Gertrude took no part. Now and then, glancing up at the speakers, she continued her romp with the kitten. At length, tired of her frolicsome pet, she rose with a half-suppressed yawn, and sauntered up to her husband's chair. Softly and lovingly her pretty little pink palms were passed over her husband's darkened brow, and her fingers drew his hair now on one side, now on the other, while she peeped over his shoulder to watch the effect of the arrangement. The caresses were inopportune. Her touch annoyed him. He shook it off, and stretching out his arm, put her gently but firmly away, saying coldly, There is a chair, Gertrude." Edna's eyes looked steadily into his with an expression of grave, sorrowful reproof, of expostulation, and the flush deepened on his face as his eyes fell before her rebuking gaze. Perhaps the young wife had become accustomed to such rebuffs. At all events, she evinced neither mortification nor surprise, but twirled her silk tassel vigorously round her finger, and exclaimed, "Oh, Gordon, have you not forgotten to give Edna that letter, written by the gentleman we met at Palermo? Edna, he paid your book some splendid compliments. I fairly clapped my hands at his praises, didn't I, Gordon?" Mr. Lee drew a letter from the inside pocket of his coat, and as he gave it to the orphan, said with a touch of bitterness in his tone, "Pardon my negligence. Probably you will find little news in it, as he is one of your old victims, and you can guess its contents." The letter was from Sir Roger, and while he expressed great grief at hearing, through Mr. Manning's notes, that her health was seriously impaired, he renewed the offer of his hand and asked permission to come and plead his suit in person. As Edna hurriedly glanced over the pages and put them in her pocket, Gertrude said gaily, "Shame on you, Gordon. Do you mean to say, or rather to insinuate, that all who read Edna's book are victimized?" He looked at her from under thickening eyebrows, and replied with undisguised impatience, "No, your common sense ought to teach you that such was not my meaning or intention. Edna places no such interpretation on my words." "Common sense! Oh, Gordon, dearie, how unreasonable you are! Why, you have told me 1,000 times that I had not a particle of common sense except on the subject of juleps, and how then, in the name of wonder, can you expect me to show any? I never pretended to be a great shining genius like Edna, whose writings all the world is talking about. I only want to be wise enough to understand you, dearie, and make you happy. Gordon, don't you feel any better? What makes your face so red?" She went back to his chair and leaned her lovely head close to his, while an anxious expression filled her large blue eyes. Gordon Lee realized that his marriage was a terrible mistake, which only death could rectify, but even in his wretchedness he was just, blaming only himself, exonerating his wife. Had he not wooed the love of which already he was weary? Having deceived her at the altar, was there justification for his dropping the mask at the hearthstone? Nay, the skeleton must be no rattling of skull and crossbones to freeze the blood in the sweet laughing face of the trusting bird. Now her clinging tenderness, her affectionate humility, upbraided him as no harsh words could possibly have done. With a smothered sigh, he passed his arm around her and drew her closer to his side. "At least my little wife is wise enough to teach her husband to be ashamed of his petulance, and quite wise enough, dear Gertrude, to make him very proud and happy. For you ought to be able to say with the sweetest singer in all merry England, 'But I look up and he looks down,' and thus our married eyes can meet, unclouded his in clear frown, and gravely sweet." As Edna glanced at the young wife and uttered these words, a mist gathered in her own eyes, and collecting her sewing utensils, she went to her room to pack her trunk. During her stay at the parsonage she had not attended service in the church, because Mr. Hammond was lonely, and her Sabbaths were spent in reading to him. But her old associates in the choir insisted that before she returned to New York she should sing with them once more. Thus far she had declined all invitations, but on the morning of the last day of her visit the organist called to say that a distinguished divine from a distant state would fill Mr. Hammond's pulpit, and as the best and leading soprano in the choir was disabled by severe cold and could not be present, he begged that Edna would take her place and sing a certain solo in the music which he had selected for an opening piece. Mr. Hammond, who was pardonably proud of his choir, was anxious that the stranger should be greeted and inspired by fine music, and urged Edna's compliance with the request. Reluctantly she consented, and for the first time duty and love seemed to signal a truce, to shake hands over the preliminaries of a treaty for peace. As she passed through the churchyard and walked up the steps where a group of Sabbath school children sat talking, her eyes involuntarily sought the dull brown spot on the marble. Over it little Herbert Inge had spread his white handkerchief and piled thereon his Testament and Catechism, laying on the last one of those gilt-bordered and handsome pictorial cards containing a verse from the Scriptures, which are frequently distributed by Sabbath school teachers. Edna stooped and looked at the picture covering the blood stain. It represented our Saviour on the Mount, delivering the sermon, and in golden letters were printed his words, "Judge not that ye be not judged, for with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged, and with what measure ye mete, it shall be measured to you again." The eyes of the divine preacher seemed to look into hers, and the outstretched hand to point directly at her. She trembled, and hastily kissing the sweet red lips which little Herbert held up to her, she went in and up to the gallery. The congregation assembled slowly, and as almost all the faces were familiar to Edna, each arrival revived something of the past. Here the flashing silk flounces of a young belle brushed the straight black folds of a widow's weeds. On the back of one seat was stretched the rough brown hand of a poor laboring man. On the next lay the dainty fingers of a matron of wealth and fashion, who had entirely forgotten to draw a glove over her sparkling diamonds. In all the splendor of velvet, feathers, and sea-green wire, Mrs. Montgomery sailed proudly into her pew, convoying her daughter Maud, who was smiling and whispering to her escort, and just behind them came a plainly clad but happy young mechanic, a carpenter, clasping to his warm, honest heart the arm of his sweet-faced, gentle wife, and holding the hand of his rosy-cheeked, bright-eyed 3-year-old boy, who toddled along, staring at the brilliant pictures on the windows. When Mr. Lee and Gertrude entered, there was a general stir, a lifting of heads and twisting of necks in order to ascertain what new styles of bonnet, lace, and mantle prevailed in Paris. A moment after, Mrs. Murray walked slowly down the aisle, and Edna's heart seemed to stand still as she saw Mr. Murray's powerful form. He stepped forward, and while he opened the door of the pew and waited for his mother to see herself, his face was visible. Then he sat down, closing the door. The minister entered, and as he ascended the pulpit, the organ began to breathe its solemn welcome. When the choir rose and commenced their course, Edna stood silent, with her book in her hand and her eyes fixed on the Murrays' pew. The strains of triumph ceased. The organ only sobbed its sympathy to the thorn-crowned Christ, struggling along the Via Dolorosa, and the orphan's quivering lips parted, and she sang her solo. As her magnificent voice rose and rolled to the arched roof, people forgot propriety and turned to look at the singer. She saw Mrs. Murray start and glance eagerly up at her, and for an instant the grand, pure voice faltered slightly, as Edna noticed that the mother whispered something to the son. But he did not turn his proud head. He only leaned his elbow on the side of the pew next to the aisle, and rested his temple on his hand. When the preliminary services ended, and the minister stood up in the shining pulpit and commenced his discourse, Edna felt that St. Elmo had at last enlisted angels in his behalf, for the text was contained in the warning, whose gilded letters hid the blood spot, "Judge not, that ye be not judged." As far as two among his auditory were concerned, the preacher might as well have addressed his sermon to the mossy slabs visible through the windows. Both listened to the text, and neither heard any more. Edna sat looking down at Mr. Murray's massive, finely poised head, and she could see the profile contour of features regular and dark, as if carved in bronze. During the next half hour her vivid imagination sketched and painted a vision of enchantment, of what might have been if that motionless man below, there in the crimson-cushioned pew, had only kept his soul from grievous sins, a vision of a happy, proud young wife reigning at leur bocage, shedding the warm, rosy light of her love over the lonely life of its master, adding to his strong, clear intellect and ripe experience the silver flame of her genius, borrowing from him broader and more profound views of her race on which to base her ideal aesthetic structures, softening, refining his nature, strengthening her own, helping him to help humanity, loving all good, being good, doing good, serving and worshipping God together, walking hand in hand with her husband through earth's wide valley of Baca, with peaceful faces full of faith looking heavenward. God pity them both, and pity us all, who vainly the dreams of youth recall, for of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, "It might have been." At last, with a faint moan, which reached to no ear but that of him who never slumbers, Edna withdrew her eyes from the spot where Mr. Murray sat, and raised them toward the pale Christ, whose wan lips seemed to murmur, "Be of good cheer. He that overcometh shall inherit all things. What I do thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter." The minister, standing beneath the picture of the Master whom he served, closed the Bible and ended his discourse by hurling his text as a thunderbolt at those whose upturned faces watched him. "Finally, brethren, remember under all circumstances the awful admonition of Jesus, 'Judge not, that ye be not judged.'" The organ peals and the doxology were concluded. The benediction fell like God's dew, alike on sinner and on saint, and amid the solemn moaning of the gilded pipes, the congregation turned to quit the church. With both hands pressed over her heart, Edna leaned heavily against the railing. "Tomorrow I go away forever. I shall never see his face again in this world. Oh, I want to look at it once more." As he stepped into the aisle, Mr. Murray threw his head back slightly, and his eyes swept up the gallery and met hers. It was a long, eager, heart-searching gaze. She saw a countenance more fascinating than of old, for the sardonic glare had gone, the bitterness, the dare-man, dare-brute, dare-devil expression had given place to a stern mournfulness, and the softening shadow of deep contrition and manly sorrow hovered over features where scoffing cynicism had so long scowled. The magnetism of St. Elmo's eyes was never more marvellous than when they rested on the beautiful white face of the woman he loved so well, whose calm, holy eyes shone like those of an angel as they looked sadly down at his. In the mystic violet light with which the rich stained glass flooded the church, that pallid, suffering face, sublime in its meekness and resignation, hung above him like one of Perugino's saints over kneeling mediaeval worshippers. As the moving congregation bore him nearer to the door, she leaned farther over the mahogany balustrade, and a snowy crocus which she wore at her throat snapped its brittle stem and floated down till it touched his shoulder. He laid one hand over it, holding it there, and while a prayer burned in his splendid eyes, hers smiled in a melancholy farewell. The crowd swept the tall form forward under the arches, beyond the fluted columns of the gallery, and the long gaze ended. Ah, well for us all, some sweet hope lies deeply buried from human eyes, and in the hereafter angels may roll the stone from its grave away. End of chapter 33.
Chapter 34 of St. Elmo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. St. Elmo by Augusta Jane Evans. Chapter 34. I am truly thankful that you have returned. I'm quite worn out trying to humor Felix's whims and take your place. He has actually lost 10 pounds, and if you had stayed away a month longer, I think it would have finished my poor boy, who has set you up as an idol in his heart. He almost had a spasm last week when his father told him he had better reconcile himself to your absence, as he believed that you would never come back to the drudgery of the schoolroom. I'm very anxious about him. His health is more feeble than it has been since he was 5 years old. My dear, you have no idea how you have been missed. Your admirers call by scores to ascertain when you may be expected home, and I do not exaggerate in the least when I say that there is a champagne basket full of periodicals and letters upstairs that have arrived recently. You will find them piled on the table and desk in your room. Where are the children? Asked Edna, glancing around the sitting-room, into which Mrs. Andrews had drawn her. Hattie is spending the day with Lila Manning, who is just recovering from a severe attack of scarlet fever, and Felix is in the library trying to sleep. He has one of his nervous headaches today. Poor fellow, he tries so hard to overcome his irritable temper and to grow patient, but I am growing fonder of him every day. How travel-spent and ghastly you are. Sit down, and I will order some refreshments. Take this wine, my dear, and presently you shall have a cup of chocolate. Thank you, not any wine. I only want to see Felix. She went to the library, cautiously opened the door, and crept softly across the floor to the end of the sofa. The boy lay looking through the window and up beyond the walls and chimneys at the sapphire pavement where rolled the sun. Casual observers thought the cripple's face ugly and disagreeable, but the tender, loving smile that lighted the countenance of the governess as she leaned forward told that some charm lingered in the sharpened features overcast with sickly sallowness. In his large, deep-set eyes, over which the heavy brows arched like a roof, she saw now a strange expression that frightened her. Was it the awful shadow of the 3 singing spinners whom Catullus painted at the wedding of Peleus? As the child looked into the blue sky, did he catch a glimpse of their trailing white robes, purple-edged, of their floating rose-colored veils? Above all, did he hear the unearthly chorus which they chanted as they spun? Curete du centis subtenina corita fusi. The governess was seized by a vague apprehension as she watched her pupil, and bending down, she said fondly, "Felix, my darling, I have come back. Never again while I live will I leave you." The almost
bewildering joy that flashed into his countenance mutely but eloquently welcomed her, as, kneeling beside the sofa, she wound her arms around him and drew his head to her shoulder. "Edna, is Mr. Hammond dead?" "No, he is almost well again, and needs me no more. I need you more than anybody else ever did. Oh, Edna, I thought sometimes you would stay at the South, that you love so well, and I should see you no more, and then all the light seemed to die out of the world, and the flowers were not sweet, and the stars were not bright, and oh, I was glad I had not long to live." "Hush, you must not talk so. How do you know that you may not live as long as Ahasuerus, the everlasting Jew? My dear little boy, in all this wide earth you are the only one whom I have to love and cling to, and we will be happy together. Darling, your head aches today." She pressed her lips twice to his hot forehead. "Yes, but the heartache was much the hardest to bear until you came. Mamma has been very good and kind, and stayed at home and read to me, but I wanted you, Edna. I do not believe that I have been wicked since you left, for I prayed all the while that God would bring you back to me. I've tried hard to be patient." With her cheek nestled against his, Edna told him many things that had occurred during their separation, and noticed that his eyes brightened suddenly and strangely. "Edna, I have a secret to tell you, something that even mamma is not to know just now. You must not laugh at me. While you were gone, I wrote a little manuscript, and it is dedicated to you, and some day I hope it will be printed. Are you glad, Edna? My beautiful, pale Edna?" "Felix, I'm very glad you love me sufficiently to dedicate your little manuscript to me. But, my dear boy, I must see it before I can say I'm glad you wrote it. If you had been here, it would not have been written, because then I should merely have talked out all the ideas to you. But you were far away, and so I talked to my paper. After all, it was only a dream. One night I was feverish, and mamma read aloud those passages that you marked in that great book, Maury's Physical Geography of the Sea, that you admire and quote so often, and of which I remember you said once, in talking to Mr. Manning, that it rolled its warm, beautiful, sparkling waves of thought across the cold grey sea of science, just like the Gulf Stream it treated of. Two of the descriptions which mamma read were so splendid that they rang in my ears like the music of the Swiss bell-ringers. One was the account of the atmosphere by Dr. Buist of Bombay, and the other was the description of the Indian Ocean, which was quoted from Schleiden's lecture. My fever was high, and when at last I went to sleep, I had a queer dream about madrepores and medusae, and I wrote it down as well as I could, and called it Algae Adventures in a Voyage Round the World. Edna, I have stolen something from you, and as you will be sure to find it out when you read my little story, where there is a long hard word missing in the manuscript, I will tell you about it now. Do you recollect talking to me one evening when we were walking on the beach at the Willows about some shell-clad animalcula, which you said were so very small that Professor Schultz of Bonn found no less than 1.5 million of their minute shells in an ounce of pulverized quartz from the shore of Moladaigata? Well, I put all you told me in my little manuscript. For my life I could not think of the name of the class to which they belong. Do you recollect it? Let me think a moment. Was it not foraminifera? That's the identical word, foraminifera. No wonder I could not think of it. 6 syllables tied up in a scientific knot. Phew! It makes my head ache worse to try to recollect it. How stoop-shouldered your memory must be from carrying such heavy loads. It is a regular camel. Yes, it is a meek, faithful beast of burden, and will very willingly bear the weight of that scientific name until you want to use it. So do not tax your mind now. You said you stole it from me, but my dear, ambitious authorling, my little round jacket scribbler, I wish you to understand distinctly that I do not consider that I have been robbed. The fact was discovered by Professor Schultz, and bequeathed by him to the world. From that instant it became universal, common property, which any man, woman, or child may use at pleasure, provided a tribute of gratitude is paid to the donor. Every individual is in some sort an intellectual bank, issuing bills of ideas, very often specious, but not always convertible into gold or silver. And now, my precious little boy, recollect that just as long as I have any capital left, you can borrow, and some day I will turn Shylock and make you pay me with usury. Edna, I should like above all things to write a book of stories for poor sick children, little tales that would make them forget their suffering and deformity. If I could even reconcile one lame boy to being shut up indoors, while others are shouting and skating in the sunshine, I should not feel as if I were so altogether useless in the world. Edna, do you think that I shall ever be able to do so? Perhaps so, dear Felix, certainly, if God wills it. When you are stronger, we will study and write together. But today you must compose yourself and be silent. Your fever is rising. The doctor left some medicine yonder in that goblet, but mamma has forgotten to give it to me. I will take a spoonful now, if you please. His face was much flushed, and as she kissed him and turned away, he exclaimed, "Oh, where are you going?" "To my room, to take off my hat." "Do not be gone long. I'm so happy now that you are here again. But I don't want you to get out of my sight. Come back soon and bathe my head." On the following day, when Mr. Manning called to welcome her home, he displayed an earnestness and depth of feeling which surprised the governess. Putting his hand on her arm, he said in a tone that had lost its metallic ring, "How fearfully changed since I saw you last. I knew you were not strong enough to endure the trial, and if I had had a right to interfere, you should never have gone." "Mr. Manning, I do not quite understand your meaning." "Edna, to see you dying by inches is bitter indeed. I believed that you would marry Murray. At least I knew any other woman would. And I felt that to refuse his affection would be a terrible trial, through which you could not pass with impunity. Why you rejected him, I have no right to inquire, but I have a right to ask you to let me save your life. I am well aware that you do not love me, but at least you can esteem and entirely trust me. And once more I hold out my hand to you and say, give me the wreck of your life. Oh, give me the ruins of your heart. I will guard you tenderly. We will go to Europe, to the East, and rest of mind and easy traveling and change of scene will restore you. I never realized, never dreamed how much my happiness depended upon you until you left the city. I've always relied so entirely upon myself, feeling the need of no other human being. But now, separated from you, I am restless, am conscious of a vague discontent. If you spend the next year as you have spent the last, you will not survive it. I have conferred with your physician. He reluctantly told me your alarming condition, and have come to plead with you for the last time not to continue your suicidal course, not to destroy the life, which, if worthless to you, is inexpressibly precious to a man who prays to be allowed to take care of it, a man who realizes that it is necessary to the usefulness and peace of his own lonely life, who wishes no other reward on earth but the privilege of looking into your approving eyes when his daily work is ended and he sits down at his fireside. Edna, I do not ask for your love, but I beg for your hand, your confidence, your society, for the right to save you from toil. Will you go to the old world with me? Looking suddenly up at him, she was astonished to find tears in his searching and usually cold eyes. Scandinavian tradition reports that 7 parishes were once overwhelmed and still lie buried under snow and ice, and yet occasionally those church bells are heard ringing clearly under the glaciers of the Folge Fond. So, in the frozen crystal depths of this man's nature, his long silent, smothered affections began to chime. A proud smile trembled over Edna's face as she saw how entirely she possessed the heart of one whom above all other men she most admired. Mr. Manning, the assertion that you regard your life as imperfect, incomplete, without the feeble complement of mine, that you find your greatest happiness in my society, is the most flattering, the most gratifying tribute which ever has been or ever can be paid to my intellect. It is a triumph indeed, and because unsought, surely it is a pardonable pride that makes my heart throb. This assurance of your high regard is the brightest earthly crown I shall ever wear. But, sir, you err egregiously in supposing that you would be happy wedded to a woman who did not love you. You think now that if we were only married, my constant presence in your home, my implicit confidence in your character, would fully content you. But here you fail to understand your own heart, and I know that the consciousness that my affection was not yours would make you wretched. No, no, my dear noble friend. God never intended us for each other. I cannot go to the old world with you. I know how peculiarly precarious is my tenure of life, and how apparently limited is my time for work in this world, but I am content. I try to labor faithfully, listening for the summons of him who notices even the death of sparrows. God will not call me hence so long as he has any work for me to do on earth, and when I become useless and can no longer serve him here, I do not wish to live. Through Christ, I am told, let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Mr. Manning, I am not ignorant of nor indifferent to my physical condition, but thank God I can say truly I am not troubled, neither am I afraid, and my faith is all as God wills, who wisely heeds to give or to withhold, and knoweth more of all my needs than all my prayers have told. The editor took off his glasses and wiped them, but the dimness was in his eyes, and after a minute, during which he recovered his old calmness and hushed the holy chime, muffling the fond bells, he said gaily and quietly, Edna, one favor at least you will grant me. The death of a relative in Louisiana has placed me in possession of an ample fortune, and I wish you to take my little Lila and travel for several years. You are the only woman I ever knew to whom I would entrust her and her education, and it would gratify me beyond expression to feel that I had afforded you the pleasure which cannot fail to result from such a tour. Do not be too proud to accept a little happiness from my hands. Thank you, my generous, noble friend. I gratefully accept a great deal of happiness at this instant, but your kind offer I must decline. I cannot leave Felix. He sighed, took his hat, and his eyes ran over the face and figure of the governess. Edna Earle, your stubborn will makes you nearly akin to those gigantic fuci which are said to grow and flourish as submarine forests in the stormy channel of Terra del Fuego, where they shake their heads defiantly, always trembling, always triumphing in the fierce lashing of waves that wear away rocks. You belong to a very rare order of human algae, rocked and reared in the midst of tempests that would either bow down or snap asunder or beat out most natures. As you will not grant my petition, try to forget it. We will bury the subject. Good-bye. I shall call tomorrow afternoon to take you to drive. With renewed zest, Edna devoted every moment stolen from Felix to the completion of her new book. Her first had been a bounteous promise, at least, so said criticdom, and she felt that the second would determine her literary position, would either place her reputation as an author beyond all cavil, or utterly crush her ambition. Sometimes, as she bent over her manuscript and paused to reread some passage just penned, which she had laboriously composed and thought particularly good as an illustration of the ideas she was striving to embody perspicuously, a smile would flit across her countenance while she asked herself, will my readers see it as I see it? Will they thank me for my high opinion of their culture in assuming that it will be quite as plain to them as to me? If there should accidentally be an allusion to classical or scientific literature which they do not understand at the first hasty, careless, novel-reading glance, will they inform themselves, and then appreciate my reason for employing it, and thank me for the hint, or will they attempt to ridicule my pedantry? When will they begin to suspect that what they may imagine sounds learned in my writings merely appears so to them because they have not climbed high enough to see how vast, how infinite is the sphere of human learning? No, no, dear reader, shivering with learning phobia, I am not learned. You are only a very little more ignorant. Doubtless you know many things which I should be glad to learn. Come, let us barter. Let us all study the life of Giovanni Pico Mirandola, and then we shall begin to understand the meaning of the word learned. Edna unintentionally and continually judged her readers according to her own standard, and so eager, so unquenchable was her thirst for knowledge, that she could not understand how the utterance of some new fact or the redressing or presentation of some forgotten idea could possibly be regarded as an insult by the person thus benefited. Her first book taught her what was termed her surplus paraded erudition, had wounded the amour propre of the public, but she was conscientiously experimenting on public taste, and though some of her indolent, luxurious readers, who wished even their thinking done by proxy, shuddered at the spring water pumped upon their nerves, she good-naturedly overlooked their grimaces and groans, and continued the hydropathic treatment even in her second book, hoping some good effects from the shock. Of one intensely gratifying fact she could not fail to be thoroughly informed by the avalanche of letters which almost daily covered her desk. She had at least ensconced herself securely in a citadel, whence she could smilingly defy all assaults, in the warm hearts of her noble countrywomen. Safely sheltered in their sincere and devoted love, she cared little for the shafts that rattled and broke against the rocky ramparts, and recoiling dropped out of sight in the moat below. So with many misgivings and much hope and great patience she worked on assiduously, and early in summer her book was finished and placed in the publisher's hands. In the midst of her anxiety concerning its reception, a new and terrible apprehension took possession of her, for it became painfully evident that Felix, whose health had never been good, was slowly but steadily declining. Mrs. Andrews and Edna took him to Sharon, to Saratoga, and to various other favorite resorts for invalids, but with no visible results that were at all encouraging, and at last they came home almost disheartened. Dr. Howell finally prescribed a sea voyage, and a sojourn of some weeks at Aubonne in the Pyrenees, as those waters had effected some remarkable cures. As the doctor quitted the parlour, where he held a conference with Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, the latter turned to her husband, saying, "It is useless to start anywhere with Felix, unless Miss Earle can go with us, for he would fret himself to death in a week. Really, Louis, it is astonishing to see how devoted they are to each other. Feeble as that woman is, she will always sit up whenever there is any medicine to be given during the night, and while he was ill at Sharon, she did not close her eyes for a week. I can't help feeling jealous of his affection for her, and I spoke to her about it. He was asleep at the time, with his hand grasping one of hers, and when I told her how trying it was for a mother to see her child's whole heart given to a stranger, to hear morning, noon, and night, Edna, always Edna, never once mamma, I wish you could have seen the strange, suffering expression that came into her pale face. Her lips trembled so that she could scarcely speak, but she said meekly, 'Oh, forgive me if I have won your child's heart, but I love him. You have your husband and daughter, your brother and sister, but I have only Felix. I've nothing else to cling to in all this world.' Then she kissed his poor little fingers and wept as if her heart would break, and wrung her hands and begged me again and again to forgive her if he loved her best. She is the strangest woman I ever knew. Sometimes when she is sitting by me in church I watch her calm, cold, white face, and she makes me think of a snow statue. But if Felix says anything to arouse her feelings and call out her affection, she is a volcano. It is very rarely that one finds a beautiful woman distinguished by her genius, admired and courted by the reading public, devoting herself as she does to our dear little crippled darling. Well, I confess I'm jealous of her. Her kindness to my child makes me love her more than I can express. Louis, she must go with us. Poor thing, she seems to be failing almost as fast as Felix, and I barely believe he should die. It would kill her. Did you notice how she paced the floor while the doctors were consulting in Felix's room? She loves nothing but my precious lame boy." "Certainly, Kate, she must go with you. I quite agree with you, my dear, that Felix is dependent upon her, and would not derive half the benefit from the trip if she remained at home. I confess she has cured me to a great extent of my horror of literary characters. She is the only one I ever saw who was really lovable, and not a walking parody on her own writings. You would be surprised at the questions constantly asked me about her habits and temper. People seem so curious to learn all the routine of her daily life. Last week a member of our club quoted something from her writings, and said that she was one of the few authors of the day whose books, without having first examined, he would put into the hands of his daughters. He remarked, I can trust my girl's characters to her training, for she is a true woman, and if she errs at all in any direction, it is the right one, only a little too rigidly followed. I'm frequently asked how she is related to me, for people cannot believe that she is merely the governess of our children. Kate, will you tell her that it is my desire that she should accompany you? Speak to her at once, that I may know how many staterooms I shall engage on the steamer. Come with me, Louis, and speak to her yourself. They went upstairs together and paused on the threshold of Felix's room to observe what was passing within. The boy was propped by pillows into an upright position on the sofa, and was looking curiously into a small basket which Edna held on her lap. She was reading to him a touching little letter just received from an invalid child, who had never walked, who was confined always to the house, and wrote to thank her in sweet, childish style for a story which she had read in the magazine and which made her very happy. The invalid stated that her chief amusement consisted in tending a few flowers that grew in pots in her windows, and in token of her gratitude she had made a nosegay of mignonette, pansies, and geranium leaves, which she sent with her scrawling letter. In conclusion, the child asked that the woman whom, without having seen, she yet loved, would be so kind as to give her a list of such books as a little girl ought to study, and to write her just a few lines that she could keep under her pillow to look at now and then. As Edna finished reading the note, Felix took it to examine the small, indistinct characters, and said, "Dear little thing, don't you wish we knew her? Louis Lawrence? Of course you will answer it, Edna?" "Yes, immediately, and tell her how grateful I am for her generosity in sparing me a portion of her pet flowers. Each word in her sweet little letter is as precious as a pearl, for it came from the very depths of her pure heart. Oh, what a blessed thing it is to feel that you are doing some good in the world. That little Louis says she prays for you every night before she goes to sleep. What a comfort such letters must be to you. Edna, how happy you look, but there are tears shining in your eyes. They always come when you are glad. What books will you tell her to study? I will think about the subject and let you read my answer. Give me the notelet. I want to put it away securely among my treasures. How deliciously fragrant the flowers are. Only smell them, Felix. Here, my darling, I will give them to you, and write to the little Louis how happy she made two people." She lifted the delicate bouquet, so daintily fashioned by fairy child fingers, inhaled the perfume, and as she put it in the thin fingers of the cripple, she bent forward and kissed his fever-parched lips. At this instant Felix saw his parents standing at the door and held up the flowers triumphantly. "Oh, mamma, come smell this mignonette. Why can't we grow some in boxes in our window?" Mr. Andrews leaned over his son's pillows, softly put his hand on the boy's forehead, and said, "My son, Miss Earle professes to love you very much, but I doubt whether she really means all she says, and I am determined to satisfy myself fully. Just now I cannot leave my business, but mamma intends to take you to Europe next week, and I want to know whether Miss Earle will leave all her admirers here, and go with you and help mamma to nurse you. Do you think she will?" Mrs. Andrews stood with her hand resting on the shoulder of the governess, watching the varying expression of her child's countenance. "I think, papa, I hope she will. I believe she—" He paused, and struggling up from his pillows, he stretched out his poor little arms, and exclaimed, "Oh, Edna, you will go with me? You promised you would never forsake me. Tell papa you will go." His head was on her shoulder, his arms were clasped tightly around her neck. She laid her face on his and was silent. Mr. Andrews placed his hand on the orphan's bowed head. "Miss Earle, you must let me tell you that I look upon you as a member of my family, that my wife and I love you almost as well as if you were one of our children. I hope you will not refuse to accompany Kate on the tour she contemplates. Let me take your own father's place, and I shall regard it as a great favour to me and mine, if you will consent to go, and allow me to treat you always as I do my Hattie. I've no doubt you will derive as much benefit from travelling as I certainly hope for Felix." "Thank you, Mr. Andrews. I appreciate your generosity, and I prize the affection and confidence which you and your wife have shown me. I came an utter stranger into your house, and you kindly made me one of the family circle. I am alone in the world, and have become strongly attached to your children. Felix is not merely my dear pupil, he is my brother and my companion, my little darling. I cannot be separated from him. Next to his mother, he belongs to me. Oh, I will travel with him anywhere that you and Mrs. Andrews think it best he should go. I will never, never leave him." She disengaged the boy's arms, laid him back on his pillows, and went to her own room. In the midst of prompt preparations for departure, Edna's new novel appeared. She had christened it "Shining Thorns on the Hearth," and dedicated it to "My countrywomen, the queens who reigned thereon." The aim of the book was to discover the only true and allowable and womanly sphere of feminine work, and though the theme was threadbare, she fearlessly picked up the frayed woof and rewove it. The tendency of the age was to equality and communism, and this, she contended, was undermining the golden throne shining in the blessed and hallowed light of the hearth, whence every true woman ruled the realm of her own family. Regarding every pseudo-reform which struck down the social and political distinction of the sexes as a blow that crushed one of the pillars of woman's throne, she earnestly warned the crowned heads of the danger to be apprehended from the unfortunate and deluded female malcontents, who, dethroned in their own realm and despised by their quondam subjects, roamed as pitiable royal exiles threatening to usurp man's kingdom. And to proud happy mothers, guarded by praetorian bands of children, she reiterated the assurance that those who rocked the cradle ruled the world. Most carefully she sifted the records of history, tracing in every epoch the sovereigns of the hearth throne who had reigned wisely and contentedly, ennobling and refining humanity, and she proved by illustrious examples that the borders of the feminine realm could not be enlarged without rendering the throne unsteady and subverting God's law of order. Woman reigned by divine right only at home, if married, in the hearts of husband and children, and not in the gilded, bedizened palace of fashion, where thinly veiled vice and frivolity hold carnival, and social upas and social asps wave and trail. If single, in the affections of brothers and sisters and friends, as the golden scepter in the hands of parents. If orphaned, she should find sympathy and gratitude and usefulness among the poor and the afflicted. Consulting the statistics of single women, and familiarizing herself with the arguments advanced by the advocates of that progress which would indiscriminately throw open all professions to women, she entreated the poor of her own sex, if ambitious to become sculptors, painters, writers, teachers in schools or families, or else to remain manteau makers, milliners, spinners, dairymaids, but on the peril of all womanhood not to meddle with scalpel or red tape, and to shun rostra of all description, remembering St. Paul's injunction that it is not permitted unto women to speak, and even that it is a shame for women to speak in the church. To married women who thirsted for a draught of the turbid waters of politics, she said, if you really desire to serve the government under which you live, recollect that it was neither the speeches thundered from the forum, nor the prayers of priests and augurs, nor the iron tramp of glittering legions, but the ever triumphant maternal influence, the potent, the pleading my son of Volumnia, the mother of Coriolanus, that saved Rome. To discontented spinsters who travelled like Pandora over the land, haranguing audiences that secretly laughed at and despised them, to these unfortunate women, clamoring for power and influence in the national councils, she pointed out that quiet, happy home at Barley Wood, whence immortal Hannah More sent forth those writings which did more to tranquilize England and bar the hearts of its yeomanry against the temptations of red republicanism than all the eloquence of Burke and the cautious measures of Parliament. Some errors of style, which have been pointed out by critics as marring her earlier writings, Edna had endeavoured to avoid in this book, which she humbly offered to her countrywomen as the best of which she was capable. From the day of its appearance it was a success, and she had the gratification of hearing that some of the seed she had sown broadcast in the land fell upon good ground, and promised an abundant harvest. Many who called to bid her good-bye on the day before the steamer sailed found it impossible to disguise their apprehensions that she would never return, and some who looked tearfully into her face and whispered Godspeed thought that they saw the dread signet of death set on her white brow. To Edna it was inexpressibly painful to cross the Atlantic while Mr. Hammond's health was so feeble, and over the long farewell letter which she sent him with a copy of her new book the old man wept. Mrs. Murray had seemed entirely estranged since that last day spent at Le Bocage, and had not written a line since the orphans returned to New York. But when she received the new novel and the affectionate, mournful, meek note that accompanied it, Mrs. Murray laid her head on her son's bosom and sobbed aloud. Dr. Howell and Mr. Manning went with Edna aboard the steamer, and both laughed heartily at her efforts to disengage herself from a pertinacious young book vendor, who with his arms full of copies of her own book stopped her on deck and volubly extolled its merits, insisting that she should buy one to while away the tedium of the voyage. Dr. Howe gave final directions concerning the treatment of Felix, and then came to speak to the governors. Even now, sadly, as you have abused your constitution, I shall have some hope of seeing gray hairs about your temples, if you will give yourself unreservedly to relaxation of mind. You've already accomplished so much that you can certainly afford to rest for some months at least. Read nothing, write nothing except long letters to me, study nothing but the aspects of nature and European scenery, and you will come back and prove to the country that is so justly proud of you. Disobey my injunctions, and I shall soon be called to mourn over the announcement that you have found an early grave, far from your native land and among total strangers. God bless you, dear child, and bring you safely back to us. As he turned away, Mr. Manning took her hand and said, I hope to meet you in Rome early in February, but something might occur to veto my program. If I should never see you again in this world, is there anything that you wish to say to me now? Yes, Mr. Manning, if I should die in Europe, have my body brought back to America and carried to the South, my own dear South that I love so well, and bury me close to Grandpa, where I can sleep quietly in the cool shadow of old Lookout. And be sure, please be sure to have my name carved just below Grandpa's on his monument. I want that one marvel to stand for us both. I will. Is there nothing else? Thank you, my dearest, good, kind friend, nothing else. Edna, promise me that you will take care of your precious life. I will try, Mr. Manning. He looked down into her worn, weary face and sighed. Then for the first time he took both her hands, kissed them, and left her. Swiftly the steamer took its way seaward through the Narrows, past the lighthouse, and the wind sang through the rigging, and the purple hills of Jersey faded from view, proving never sink a misnomer. One by one the passengers went below, and Edna and Felix were left on deck with stars burning above and blue waves bounding beneath them. As the cripple sat looking over the solemn moaning ocean, awed by its brooding gloom, did he catch in the silvery starlight a second glimpse of the rose-coloured veils and snowy vitae and purple-edged robes of the Parsai, spinning and singing as they followed the ship across the sobbing sea. He shivered, and clasping tightly the hand of his governess, said, Edna, we shall never see the Neversink again. God only knows, dear Felix, his will be done. How silvery the echoes run, thy will be done, thy will be done. End of chapter 34.
Chapter 35 of St. Elmo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. St. Elmo by Augusta Jane Evans. Chapter 35. Worthy? No, no, unworthy, most unworthy. But was Thomas worthy to tend the wandering sheep of him whom face to face he doubted? Was Peter worthy to preach the gospel of him whom he had thrice indignantly denied? Was Paul worthy to become the apostle of the Gentiles, teaching the doctrine of him whose disciples he had persecuted and slaughtered? If the repentance of Peter and Paul availed to purify their hands and hearts and sanctify them to the service of Christ, ah, God knows my contrition has been bitter and lasting enough to fit me for future usefulness. 8 months ago, when the desire to become a minister seized me so tenaciously, I wrestled with it, tried to crush it, arguing that the knowledge of my past life of sinfulness would prevent the world from trusting my professions. But those who even slightly understand my character must know that I have always been too utterly indifferent to, too unfortunately contemptuous of public opinion, to stoop to any deception in order to conciliate it. Moreover, the world will realize that in a mere worldly point of view I can possibly hope to gain nothing by this step. If I were poor, I might be accused of wanting the loaves and fishes of the profession, and if unknown and ambitious, of seeking eminence and popularity. But when a man of my wealth and social position, after spending half of his life in luxurious ease and sinful indulgence, voluntarily subjects himself to the rigid abstemiousness and self-sacrificing requirements of a ministerial career, he cannot be suspected of hypocrisy. After all, sir, I care not for the discussion of 9 days' gossip and wonder, the gibes and comments my course may occasion. I am hearkening to the counsel of my conscience. I am obeying the dictates of my heart. Feeling that my God accepts me, it matters little that men may reject me. My remorse, my repentance has been inexpressibly bitter, but the darkness has passed away, and today, thank God, I can pray with all the fervor and faith of my boyhood, when I knew that I was at peace with my Maker. Oblivion of the past I do not expect, and perhaps should not desire. I shall always wear my melancholy memories of sin, as Mussulmen wear their turban or pall, as a continual memento of death, because I have proved so fully the inadequacy of earthly enjoyments to satisfy the demands of a soul, because I tried the alluring pleasures of sin, and was satiated, utterly sickened. I turned with panting eagerness to the cool, quiet peace which reigns over the life of a true Christian pastor. I want neither fame nor popularity, but peace. Peace I must have. I have hunted the world over and over. I have sought it everywhere else, and now, thank God, I feel that it is descending slowly, slowly but surely, upon my lonely, long-tortured heart. Thank God, I have found peace after much strife and great weariness. Mr. Murray could no longer control his voice, and as he stood leaning against the mantelpiece at the parsonage, he dropped his head on his hand. St. Elmo, the purity of your motives will never be questioned, for none who knows you could believe you capable of dissembling in this matter, and my heart can scarcely contain its joy when I look forward to your future, so bright with promise, so full of usefulness. The marked change in your manner during the past 2 years has prepared this community for the important step you are to take today, and your influence with young men will be incalculable. Once your stern bitterness rendered you an object of dread, and now I find that you are respected, and people here watch your conduct with interest and even with anxiety. Ah, St. Elmo, I never imagined earth held as much pure happiness as is my portion today. To see you one of God's anointed, to see you ministering in the temple, oh, to know that when I'm gone to rest you will take my place, guard my flock, do your own work, and poor Murray's, and finish mine. This is indeed the crowning blessing of my old age. For some minutes Mr. Hammond sobbed, and lifting his face, Mr. Murray answered, As I think of the coming years consecrated to Christ, passed peacefully in endeavoring to atone for the injury and suffering I have inflicted on my fellow creatures, oh, as the picture of a calm, useful, holy future rises before me, I feel indeed that I am unworthy, most unworthy of my peace, but thank God. Oh, I see the crescent promise of my spirit hath not set, ancient founts of inspiration well through all my fancy yet. It was a beautiful Sabbath morning, just 1 year after Edna's departure, and the church was crowded to its utmost capacity, for people had come for many miles around to witness a ceremony, the announcement of which had given rise to universal comment, as the hour approached for the ordination of St. Elmo Murray to the ministry of Jesus Christ. Even the doors were filled with curious spectators, and when Mr. Hammond and St. Elmo walked down the aisle, and the old man seated himself in a chair within the altar, there was a general stir in the congregation. The officiating minister had come from a distant city to perform a ceremony of more than usual interest, and when he stood up in the pulpit and the organ thundered through the arches, St. Elmo bowed his head on his hand and sat thus during the hour that ensued. The ordination sermon was solemn and eloquent, and preached from the text in Romans, For when ye were the servants of sin, ye were free from righteousness, but now being made free from sin, and become servants to God, ye have your fruit unto holiness, and the end everlasting life. Then the minister, having finished his discourse, came down before the altar and commenced the services,
But Mr. Murray sat motionless, with his countenance concealed by his hand. Mr. Hammond approached and touched him, and as he rose led him to the altar, and presented him as a candidate for ordination. There, before the shining marble pulpit, which he had planned and built in the early years of his life for the idol of his youth, stood St. Elmo, and the congregation, especially those of his native village, looked with involuntary admiration and pride at the erect, powerful form, clad in its suit of black, at the nobly proportioned head, where grey locks were visible. But if there be any of you who knoweth any impediment or crime for the which he ought not to be received into this holy ministry, let him come forth in the name of God and show what the crime or impediment is. The preacher paused. The echo of his words died away, and perfect silence reigned. Suddenly St. Elmo raised his eyes from the railing of the altar, and turning his face slightly, looked through the eastern window at the ivy-draped vault, where slept Murray and Annie. The world was silent, but conscience and the dead accused him. An expression of intolerable pain crossed his handsome features. Then his hands folded themselves tightly together on the top of the marble balustrade, and he looked appealingly up to the pale Jesus staggering under his cross. At that instant a spotless white pigeon from the belfry found its way into the church through the open doors, circled once around the building, fluttered against the window, hiding momentarily the crown of thorns, and, frightened and confused, fell upon the fluted pillar of the pulpit. An electric thrill ran through the congregation, and as the minister resumed the services, he saw on St. Elmo's face a light, a great joy, such as human countenances rarely wear this side of the grave. When Mr. Murray knelt and the ordaining hands were laid upon his head, a sob was heard from the pew where his mother sat, and the voice of the preacher faltered as he delivered the Bible to the kneeling man, saying, "Take thou authority to preach the word of God and to administer the holy sacraments in the congregation." There were no dry eyes in the entire assembly, save two that looked out coldly blue from the pew where Mrs. Powell sat like a statue between her daughter and Gordon Lee. Mr. Hammond tottered across the altar and knelt down close to Mr. Murray, and many who knew the history of the pastor's family wept as the grey head fell on the broad shoulder of St. Elmo, whose arm was thrown around the old man's form, and the ordaining minister, with tears rolling over his face, extended his hands in benediction above them. The peace of God, which passeth all understanding, keep your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God and of his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, and the blessing of God Almighty, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost be among you, and remain with you alway. And all hearts and lips present whispered, Amen. And the organ and the choir broke forth in a grand Gloria in Excelsis. Standing there at the chancel, purified, consecrated henceforth unreservedly to Christ, Mr. Murray looked so happy, so noble, so worthy of his high calling, that his proud, fond mother thought his face was fit for an archangel's wings. Many persons who had known him in his boyhood came up with tears in their eyes and wrung his hand silently. At last Huldah pointed to the white pigeon that was now beating its wings against the gilded pipes of the organ, and said in that singularly sweet, solemn, hesitating tone with which children approach sacred things, "Oh, Mr. Murray," when it fell on the pulpit, it nearly took my breath away, for I almost thought it was the Holy Ghost. Tears, which till then he had bravely kept back, dripped over his face as he stooped and whispered to the little orphan, "Huldah, the Holy Spirit, the Comforter, came indeed, but it was not visible. It is here in my heart." The congregation dispersed. Mrs. Murray and the preacher and Huldah went to the carriage, and leaning on Mr. Murray's arm, Mr. Hammond turned to follow, but observing that the church was empty, the former said, "After a little I will come." The old man walked on, and Mr. Murray went back and knelt, resting his head against the beautiful, glittering balustrade, within which he hoped to officiate through the remaining years of his earthly career. Once the sexton, who was waiting to lock up the church, looked in, saw the man praying alone there at the altar, and softly stole away. When St. Elmo came out, the churchyard seemed deserted, but as he crossed it, going homeward, a woman rose from one of the tombstones and stood before him, the yellow-haired Jezebel, with sapphire eyes and soft, treacherous red lips, who had goaded him to madness and blasted the best years of his life. At sight of her he recoiled, as if a cobra had started up in his path. St. Elmo, my beloved, in the name of other days, stop and hear me. By the memory of our early love, I entreat you. She came close to him, and the alabaster face was marvelously beautiful in its expression of penitential sweetness. St. Elmo, can you never forgive me for the suffering I caused you in my giddy girlhood? She took his hand and attempted to raise it to her lips, but shaking off her touch, he stepped back, and steadily they looked in each other's eyes. Agnes, I forgive you. May God pardon your sins, as he has pardoned mine. He turned away, but she seized his coat sleeve and threw herself before him, standing with both hands clasping his arm. If you mean what you say, there is happiness yet in store for us. Oh, St. Elmo, how often have I longed to come and lay my head down on your bosom and tell you all. But you were so stern and harsh, I was afraid. Today, when I saw you melted, when the look of your boyhood came dancing back to your dear eyes, I was encouraged to hope that your heart had softened also toward one who so long possessed it. Is there hope for your poor Agnes? Hope that the blind, silly girl, who, ignorant of the value of the treasure, slighted and spurned it, may indeed be pardoned, when, as a woman, realizing her folly, and sensible at last of the nobility of a nature she once failed to appreciate, she comes and says what is so hard for a woman to say. Take me back to your heart, gather me up in your arms, as in the olden days, because I love you now, because only your love can make me happy. St. Elmo, we are no longer young, but believe me when I tell you that at last your own Agnes loves you as she never loved anyone, even in her girlhood. Once I preferred my cousin Murray to you, but think how giddy I must have been when I could marry before a year had settled the sod on his grave. I did not love my husband, but I married him for the same reason that I would have married you then. And yet for that there is some palliation. It was to save my father from disgrace that I sacrificed myself for money entrusted to his keeping. Money belonging to his orphan ward had been used by him in a ruinous speculation, and only prompt repayment could prevent exposure. Remember, I was so young, so vain, so thoughtless then. St. Elmo, pity me, love me, take me back to your heart. God is my witness that I do love you entirely now. Dearest, say, Agnes, I will forgive all, and trust you and love you as in the days long past. She tried to put her arms up around his neck and to rest her head on his shoulder, but he resisted and put her at arm's length from him. Holding her there, he looked at her with a cold scorn in his eyes and a heavy shadow darkening the brow that 5 minutes before had been so calm, so bright. Agnes, how dare you attempt to deceive me after all that has passed between us? O woman, in the name of all true womanhood, I could blush for you. She struggled to free herself to get closer to him, but his stern grasp was relentless, and as tears poured down her cheeks, she clasped her hands and sobbed out, You do not believe that I really love you? Oh, do not look at me so harshly. I am not deceiving you. As I hope for pardon and rest for my soul, as I hope to see my Father's face in heaven, I'm not deceiving you. I do love you. When I spoke to you about Gertrude, it cost me a dreadful pang, but I thought you loved her because she resembled me, and for my child's sake I crushed my own hopes. I wanted, if possible, to save her from suffering, but you only upbraided and heaped savage sarcasms upon me. Oh, St. Elmo, if you could indeed see my poor heart, you would not look so cruelly cold. You ought to know that I am terribly in earnest when I can stoop to beg for the ruins of a heart which in its freshness I once threw away and trampled on. He had seen her weep before, when it suited her purpose, and he only smiled and answered, Yes, Agnes, you ruined and trampled it in the mire of sin, but I have rebuilt it, and by the mercy of God I hope I have purified it. Look you, woman, when you overturned the temple, you crumbled your own image that was set up there, and I long, long ago swept out and gave to the hungry winds the despised dust of that broken idol, and over my heart you can reign no more, the only queen it has known since that awful night 23 years ago, when my faith, hope, charity were all strangled in an instant by the velvet hand I had kissed in my doting fondness, the only queen my heart has acknowledged since then, is one who in her purity soars like an angel above you and me, and her dear name is Edna Earle. Edna Earle, a puritanical fanatic, nay, a Pharisee, a cold prude, a heartless blue, a woman with some brain and no feeling, who loves nothing but her own fame, and has no sympathy with your nature. St. Elmo, are you insane? Did you not see that letter from Estelle to your mother, stating that she, Edna, would certainly be married in February to the celebrated Mr. Manning, who was then on his way to Rome to meet her? Did you see that letter? I did. And discredited it? Blindness, madness, equal to my own in the days gone by. Edna Earle exists no longer. She was married a month ago. Here, read for yourself, or you will believe that I fabricate the whole. She held a newspaper before his eyes, and he saw a paragraph marked with a circle of ink, "Marriage in Literary Circles." The very reliable correspondent of the New York writes from Rome that the Americans now in that city are on the qui vive concerning a marriage announced to take place on Thursday next at the residence of the American minister. The very distinguished parties are Miss Edna Earle, the gifted and exceedingly popular young authoress, whose works have given her an enviable reputation even on this side of the Atlantic, and Mr. Douglas G. Manning, the well-known and able editor of the magazine. The happy pair will start, immediately after the ceremony, on a tour through Greece and the Holy Land. Mr. Murray opened the paper, glanced at the date, and his swarthy face paled as he put his hands over his eyes. Mrs. Powell came nearer and once more touched his hand, but with a gesture of disgust he pushed her aside. "Away, not a word, not one word more. You are not worthy to take my darling's name upon your lips. She may be Manning's wife, God forbid it, or she may be in her grave. I've lost her, I know, but if I never see her dear angel face again in this world, it will be in consequence of my sins and of yours, and with God's help I mean to live out the remainder of my days, so that at last I shall meet her in eternity. Leave me, Agnes. Do not make me forget the vows I have today taken upon myself, in the presence of the world and of my Maker. In future, keep out of my path, which will never cross yours. Do not rouse the old hate towards you, which I am faithfully striving to overcome. The first time I went to the communion table, after the lapse of all those dreary years of sin and desperation, I asked myself, have I a right to the sacrament of the Lord's Supper? Can I face God and say, I forgive Agnes Powell? Finally, after a hard struggle, I said from the depths of my heart, even as I need and hope for forgiveness myself, I do fully forgive her. Mark you, it was my injuries that I pardoned, your treachery that I forgave. But recollect, there is a mournful truth in those words. There is no pardon for desecrated ideals. Once, in the flush of my youth, I selected you as the beau ideal of beautiful, perfect womanhood, but you fell from that lofty pedestal where my ardent, boyish love set you for worship, and you dragged me down, down, almost beyond the pale of God's mercy. I forgive all my wrongs, but take you back, love you. Ah, I can never love anyone. I never even in my boyhood loved you as I love my pure darling, my own Edna. Her memory is all I have to cheer me in my lonely work. I do not believe that she is married. No, no, but she is in her grave. For many days past I have been oppressed by a horrible presentiment that she has gone to her rest in Christ, that the next steamer will bring me tidings of her death. Do not touch me, Agnes, if there be any truth in what you have today asserted so solemnly, though I cannot believe it. For if you ridiculed and disliked me in my noble youth, how can you love the same man in the melancholy wreck of his hopes? If there be a shadow of truth in your words, you are indeed to be pitied. Ah, you and I have learned at a terrible price the deceitfulness of riches, the hollowness of this world's pleasures, and both have writhed under the poisonous fangs that always dart from the dregs of the cup of sin, which you and I have drained. Experience must have taught you also what I was so long in learning, the utter hopelessness of peace for heart and soul, save only through that religion which so far subdues even my sinful, vindictive, satanic nature, that I can say to you, you who blasted all my earthly happiness, I forgive you my sufferings, and hope that God will give you that pardon and comfort which, after awful conflicts, I have found at last. Several times you have thrust yourself into my presence, But if there remains any womanly delicacy in your nature, you will avoid me henceforth when I tell you that I loathe the sight of one whose unwomanliness stabbed my trust in womanhood, and sunk me so low that I lost Edna Earle. Agnes, go yonder, where I have spent so many hours of agony, yonder to the graves of your victims as well as mine. Go down on your knees yonder, and pray for yourself, and may God help you." He pointed to the grave vault and the slab that covered Annie and Murray Hammond, and disengaging her fingers, which still clutched his sleeve, he turned quickly and walked away. Her mournful eyes, strained wide and full of tears, followed him till his form was no longer visible, and sinking down on the monument whence she had risen at his approach, she shrouded her fair, delicate features, and rocked herself to and fro. End of chapter 35.
Chapter 36 of St. Elmo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. St. Elmo by Augusta Jane Evans. Chapter 36. How lovely! Oh, I did not think there was any place half so beautiful this side of heaven. With his head on his mother's bosom, Felix lay near the window of an upper room, looking out over the Gulf of Genoa. The crescent curve of the olive-mantled Apennines girdled the city in a rocky clasp, and mellowed by distance and the magic enamelling of evening light, each particular peak rose against the chrysoprase sky like a pyramid of lapis lazuli, around whose mighty base rolled soft waves of golden haze. Over the glassy bosom of the gulf, where glided boats filled with gay, pleasure-seeking Italians, floated the merry strains of a barcarolle, with the silvery echo of Fridolin keeping time with the silvery gleam of the dipping oars. And the sun went into the west, and down upon the water stooped an orange cloud, and the pale milky reaches flushed as glad to wear its colours, and the sultry air went out to sea, and puffed the sails of ships with thymy wafts, the breath of trodden grass. "Lift me up, mamma, higher, higher yet. I want to see the sun. There, it is gone down into the sea. I can't bear to see it set today. It seemed to say good-bye to me just then. Oh, mamma, mamma, I don't want to die. The world is so beautiful, and life is so sweet up here in the sunshine and the starlight, and it is so cold and dark down there in the grave. Oh, where is Edna? Tell her to come quick and sing something to me." The cripple shuddered and shut his eyes. He had wasted away until he looked a mere shadow of humanity, and his governess stooped and took him from his mother's arms as if he were a baby. "Edna, talk to me. Oh, don't let me get afraid to die. She laid her lips on his, and the touch calmed their shivering, and after a moment she began to repeat the apocalyptic vision of heaven. "And there shall be no night there, and they need no candle, neither light of the sun, for the Lord God giveth them light, and they shall reign for ever and ever." "But, Edna, the light does not shine down there in the grave. If you could go with me—" "A better and kinder friend will go with you, dear Felix." She sang with strange pathos, motet, that beautiful arrangement of "The Lord is my shepherd." As she reached that part where the words, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," are repeated, the weak, quavering voice of the sick boy joined hers, and when she ceased, the emaciated face was placid. The great dread had passed away for ever. Anxious to divert his thoughts, she put into his hand a bunch of orange flowers and violets, which had been sent to her that day by Mr. Manning, and taking a book from the bed, she resumed the reading of the Shepherd of Salisbury Plain, to which the invalid had never wearied of listening. But she soon saw that for once he was indifferent,
and understanding the expression of the eyes that gazed out on the purple shadows shrouding the Apennines, she closed the volume and laid the sufferer back on his pillow. While she was standing before a table preparing some nourishment to be given to him during the night, Mrs. Andrews came close to her and whispered, "Do you see much change? Is he really worse, or do my fears magnify every bad symptom?" "He is much exhausted, but I trust the stimulants will revive him. You must go to bed early and get a good sound sleep, for you look worn out. I will wake you if I see any decided change in him." Mrs. Andrews hung for some time over her child's pillow, caressing him, saying tender, soothing, motherly things, and after a while she and Hattie kissed him and went into the adjoining room, leaving him to the care of one whom he loved better than all the world beside. It was late at night before the sound of laughter, song, and chatter died away in the streets of Genoa the Magnificent. While the human tide ebbed and flowed under the windows, Felix was restless, and his companion tried to interest him by telling him the history of the Dorias, and of the siege during which Messina won such glory. Her conversation drifted away even to Ancona, and that sad but touching incident which Sismondi records of a noble patriotic young mother who gave to a starving soldier the milk that her half-famished babe required, and sent him thus refreshed and strengthened to defend the walls of her beleaguered city. The boy's fondness for history showed itself even then, and he listened attentively to her words. At length silence reigned through the marble palaces, and Edna rose to place the small lamp in an alabaster vase. As she did so, something flew into her face and fluttered to the edge of the vase, and as she attempted to brush it off, she started back, smothering a cry of horror. It was the Sphinx Atropos, the death's head moth, and there upon its breast, appallingly distinct, grinned the ghastly grey human skull. Twice it circled rapidly round the vase, uttering strange stridulous sounds, then floated up to the canopy overarching Felix's bed, and poised itself on the carved frame, waiting and flapping its wings, vulture-like. Shuddering from head to foot, notwithstanding the protest which reason offered against superstition, the governess sat down to watch the boy's slumber. His eyes were closed, and she hoped that he slept, but presently he feebly put out his skeleton hand and took hers. "Edna, mamma cannot hear me, can she? She is asleep, but I will wake her if you wish it." "No, she would only begin to cry, and that would worry me. Edna, I want you to promise me one thing." He paused a few seconds and sighed wearily. "When you all go back home, don't leave me here. Take me with you, and lay my poor little deformed body in the ground, at the willows where the sea will sing over me. We were so happy there. I always thought I should like my grave to be under the tallest willow, where our canary's cage used to hang. Edna, I don't think you will live long. I almost hope you won't, and I want you to promise me, too, that you will tell them to bury us close together, so that the very moment I rise out of my grave on the day of judgment, I will see your face. Sometimes when I think of the millions and millions that will be pressing up for their trial before God's throne on that great awful day, I'm afraid I might lose or miss you in the crowd and never find you again. But you know, if our coffins touch, you can stretch out your hand to me as you rise, and we can go together. Oh, I want your face to be the last I see here, and the first yonder." He raised his fingers slowly, and they fell back wearily on the coverlet. "Don't talk so, Felix. Oh, my darling, God will not take you away from me. Try to sleep. Shut your eyes. You need rest to compose you." She knelt down, kissed him repeatedly, and laid her face close to his on the pillow, and he tried to turn and put his emaciated arm around her neck. "Edna, I've been a trouble to you for a long time, but you will miss me when I'm gone, and you will have nothing to love. If you live long, marry Mr. Manning, and let him take care of you. Don't work so hard, dear Edna, only rest, and let him make you happy. Before I knew you, I was always wishing to die, but now I hate to leave you all alone, my own dear, pale Edna." "Oh, Felix, darling, hush, go to sleep. You wring my heart." Her sobs distressed him, and feebly patting her cheek, he said, "Perhaps if you will sing me something low, I may go to sleep. I want to hear your voice once more. Sing me that song about the child in the rose bush that Hattie likes so much. Not that, anything but that. It is too sad, my precious little darling. But I want to hear it, please, Edna." It was a painful task that he imposed, but his wishes ruled her, and she tried to steady her voice as she sang in a very low, faltering tone the beautiful but melancholy ballad. Tears rolled over her face as she chanted the verses, and when she concluded he repeated very faintly, "Sweetly it rests, and on dream wings flies, to play with the angels in paradise." He nestled his lips to hers, and after a little while murmured, "Good night, Edna. Good night, my darling." She gave him a stimulating potion and arranged his head comfortably. Ere long his heavy breathing told her that he slept, and stealing from his side, she sat down in a large chair near the head of his bed and watched him. For many months he had been failing, and they had travelled from place to place, hoping against hope that each change would certainly be beneficial. Day and night Edna had nursed him, had devoted every thought, almost every prayer to him, and now her heart seemed centred in him. Scenery, music, painting, rare manuscripts, all were ignored. She lived only for that poor dependent boy, and knew not a moment of peace when separated from him. She had ceased to study aught but his comfort and happiness, had written nothing save letters to friends, and notwithstanding her anxiety concerning the cripple, the frequent change of air had surprisingly improved her own health. For 6 months she had escaped the attacks so much dreaded, and began to believe her restoration complete, though the long-banished colour obstinately refused to return to her face, which seemed unable to recover its rounded outline. Still she was very grateful for the immunity from suffering, especially as it permitted more unremitting attendance upon Felix. She knew that his life was flickering out gently but surely, and now as she watched the pale pinched features her own quivered, and she clasped her hands and wept and stifled a groan. She had prayed so passionately and continually that he might be spared to her, but it seemed that whenever her heart-strings wrapped themselves around an idol, a jealous god tore them loose and snatched away the dear object, and left the heart to bleed. If that boy died, how utterly desolate and lonely she would be, nothing left to care for and to cling to, nothing to claim as her own, and anoint with the tender love of her warm heart. She had been so intensely interested in the expansion of his mind, had striven so tirelessly to stimulate his brain, and soften and purify his heart. She had been so proud of his rapid progress, and so ambitious for his future, and now the mildew of death was falling on her fond hopes. Ah! She had borne patiently many trials, but this appeared unendurable. She had set all her earthly happiness on a little thing, the life of a helpless cripple, and as she gazed through her tears at that shrunken, sallow face, so dear to her, it seemed hard that God denied her this one blessing. What was the praise and admiration of all the world in comparison with the loving light in that child's eyes, and the tender pressure of his lips? The woman's ambition had long been fully satisfied, and even exacting conscience, jealously guarding its shrine, saw daily sacrifices laid thereon, and smiled approvingly upon her. But the woman's hungry heart cried out, and fought fiercely, famine goaded, for its last vanishing morsel of human love and sympathy. Verily, these bread riots of the heart are fearful things, and crucified consciences too often mark their track. The little figure on the bed was so motionless that Edna crept nearer and leaned down to listen to the breathing, and her tears fell on his thick curling hair and upon the orange blossoms and violets. Standing there, she threw up her clenched hands and prayed sobbingly, "My Father, spare the boy to me. I will dedicate anew my life and his to thy work. I will make him minister of thy word, and he shall save precious souls. Oh, do not take him away. If not for a lifetime, at least spare him a few years, even one more year, oh my God." She walked to the window, rested her forehead against the stone facing, and looked out, and the wonderful witchery of the solemn night wove its spell around her. Great golden stars clustered in the clear heavens, and were reflected in the calm blue pavement of the Mediterranean, where not a ripple shivered their shining images. A waning crescent moon swung high over the eastern crest of the Apennines, and threw a weird light along the Doria's marble palace, and down on the silvery grey olives, on the glistening orange groves, snow-powdered with fragrant bloom, and in that wan, mysterious, and most melancholy light, the old miraculous mountains heaved in sight, one straining past another along the shore, the way of grand dull Odyssean ghosts, athirst to drink the cool blue wine of seas, and stare on voyagers. From some lofty campanile in a distant section of the silent city sounded the Angelus bell, and from the deep shadow of olive, vine, and myrtle that clothed the amphitheatre of hills, the convent bells caught and re-echoed it. Nature comes sometimes and says, I am ambassador for God. And the splendor of the Italian night spoke to Edna's soul as the glory of the sunset had done some years before, when she sat in the dust in the pine glades at Le Bocage, and she grew calm once more, while out of the blue depths of the starlit sea came a sacred voice that said to her aching heart, Peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. The cup was not passing away, but courage to drain it was given by Him who never calls His faithful children into the gloom of Gethsemane without having first stationed close at hand some strengthening angel. The governess went back to the bed, and there, on the pillow, rested the moth, which at her approach flew away with a humming sound and disappeared. After another hour she saw that a change was stealing over the boy's countenance, and his pulse fluttered more feebly against her cold fingers. She sprang into the next room, shook his mother, and hastened back, trying to rouse the dying boy and give him some stimulants. But though the large black eyes opened when she raised his head, there was no recognition in their fixed gaze, for the soul was preparing for its final flight, and was too busy to look out of its windows. In vain they resorted to the most powerful restoratives. He remained in the heavy stupor, with no sign of animation save the low, irregular breath, and the weak flutter of the thread-like pulse. Mrs. Andrews wept aloud, and wrung her hands, and Hattie cried passionately, as she stood in her long white nightgown at the side of her brother's bed. But there were no tears on Edna's cold grey face. She had spent them all at the foot of God's throne, and now that He had seen fit to deny her petition, she silently looked with dry eyes at the heavy rod that smote her. The night waned, the life with it. Now and then the breathing seemed to cease, but after a few seconds a faint gasp told that the clay would not yet forego its hold on the soul that struggled to be free. The poor mother seemed almost beside herself as she called on her child to speak to her once more. Sing something, Edna. Oh, perhaps he will hear. It might rouse him. The orphan shook her head and dropped her face on his. He would not hear me. No, no, he is listening to the song of those whose golden harps ring in the New Jerusalem. Out of the whitening east rose the new day, radiant in bridal garments, wearing a star on its pearly brow, and the sky flushed and the sea glowed, while silvery mists rolled up from the purple mountain gorges and rested awhile on the summits of the Apennines, and sunshine streamed over the world once more. The first rays flashed into the room, kissing the withered flowers on the bosom of the cripple, and falling warm and bright on the cold eyelids and the pulseless temples. Edna's hand was pressed to his heart, and she knew that it had given its last throb, knew that Felix Andrews had crossed the sea of glass, and in the dawn of the eternal day wore the promised morning star, and stood in peace before the Sun of Righteousness. During the 2 days that succeeded the death of Felix, Edna did not leave her room, and without her knowledge Mrs. Andrews administered opiates that stupefied her. Late on the morning of the 3rd she awoke and lay for some time trying to collect her thoughts. Her mind was clouded, but gradually it cleared, and she strained her ears to distinguish the low words spoken in the apartment next to her own. She remembered as in a feverish dream all that passed on the night that Felix died, and pressing her hand over her aching forehead, she rose and sat on the edge of her bed. The monotonous sounds in the neighboring room swelled louder for a few seconds, and now she heard very distinctly the words, "And I heard a voice from heaven, saying unto me, Write, Blessed are the dead which die in the Lord from henceforth." She shivered, and wrapped around her shoulders a bright blue shawl that had been thrown over the foot of the bed. Walking across the floor, she opened the door and looked in. The boy's body had been embalmed and placed in a coffin which rested in the centre of the room, and an English clergyman, a friend of Mr. Manning, stood at the head of the corpse and read the burial service. Mrs. Andrews and Hattie were weeping in one corner, and Mr. Manning leaned against the window with his hand on Lila's curls. As the door swung open and Edna entered, he looked up. Her dressing gown of grey merino trailed on the marble floor, and her bare feet gleamed like ivory, as one hand caught up the soft merino folds sufficiently to enable her to walk. Over the blue shawl streamed her beautiful hair, making the wan face look even more ghastly by contrast with its glossy jet masses. She stood irresolute, with her calm, mournful eyes riveted on the coffin, and Mr. Manning saw her pale lips move as she staggered toward it. He sprang to meet and intercept her, and she stretched her hands in the direction of the corpse and smiled strangely, murmuring like one in a troubled dream, "You need not be afraid, little darling. There is no night there." She reeled and put her hand to her heart and would have fallen, but Mr. Manning caught and carried her back to her room. For 2 weeks she hovered on the borders of eternity, and often the anxious friends who watched her felt that they would rather see her die than endure the suffering through which she was called to pass. She bore it silently, meekly, and when the danger seemed over and she was able to sleep without the aid of narcotics, Mrs. Andrews could not bear to look at the patient white face so hopelessly calm. No allusion was made to Felix even after she was able to sit up and drive, but once when Mr. Manning brought her some flowers she looked sorrowfully at the snowy orange blossoms, whose strong perfume made her turn paler, and said faintly, "I shall never love them, or violets again. Take them away, Hattie, out of my sight. Put them on your brother's grave. They smell of death." From that day she made a vigorous effort to rouse herself, and the boy's name never passed her lips, though she spent many hours over a small manuscript which she found among his books directed to her for revision. "Tales for Little Cripples" was the title he had given it, and she was surprised at the beauty and pathos of many of the sentences. She carefully revised and rewrote it, adding a brief sketch of the young writer, and gave it to his mother. About a month after Felix's death, the governess seemed to have recovered her physical strength, and Mrs. Andrews announced her intention of going to Germany. Mr. Manning had engagements that called him to France, and on the last day of their stay at Genoa, he came as usual to spend the evening with Edna. A large budget of letters and papers had arrived from America, and when he gave her the package containing her share, she glanced over the directions, threw them unopened into a heap on the table, and continued the conversation in which she was engaged concerning the architecture of the churches in Genoa. Mrs. Andrews had gone to the vault where the body of her son had been temporarily placed, and Edna was alone with the editor. "You ought to look into your papers. They contain very gratifying intelligence for you. Your last book has gone through 10 editions, and your praises are chanted all over your native land. Surely, if ever a woman had adulation enough to render her perfectly happy and pardonably proud, you are the fortunate individual. Already your numerous readers are inquiring when you will give them another book." She leaned her head back against her chair, and the little hands caressed each other as they rested on her knee, while her countenance was eloquent with humble gratitude for the success that God had permitted to crown her efforts, but she was silent. "Do you intend to write a book of travels, embracing the incidents that have marked your tour? I see the public expect it." "No, sir. It seems now a mere matter of course that all scribblers who come to Europe should afflict the reading world with an account of what they saw or failed to see. So many noble books have been already published, thoroughly describing this continent, that I have not the temerity, the presumption, to attempt to retouch the grand old word pictures. At present I expect to write nothing. I want to study some subjects that greatly interest me, and I shall try to inform and improve myself and keep silent until I see some phase of truth neglected, or some new aspect of error threatening mischief in society. Indeed, I have great cause for gratitude in my literary career. At the beginning I felt apprehensive that I was destined to sit always under the left hand of fortune, whom Michelangelo designed as a lovely woman seated on a revolving wheel, throwing crowns and laurel wreaths from her right hand, while only thorns dropped in a sharp, stinging shower from the other. But after a time the wheel turned, and now I feel only the soft pattering of the laurel leaves. God knows I do most earnestly appreciate his abundant blessing upon what I have thus far striven to effect. But until I see my way clearly to some subject of importance, which a woman's hand may touch, I shall not take up my pen. Books seem such holy things to me, destined to plead either for or against their creators in the final tribunal, that I dare not lightly or hastily attempt to write them. And I cannot help thinking that the author who is less earnestly and solemnly impressed with the gravity, and I may almost say the sanctity, of his or her work, is unworthy of it, and of public confidence. I dare not, even if I could, dash off articles and books as the rower shakes water drops from his oars, and I humbly acknowledge that what success I may have achieved is owing to hard, faithful work. I have received so many kind letters from children that sometime, if I live to be wise enough, I want to write a book especially for them. I'm afraid to attempt it just now, for it requires more mature judgment and experience, and greater versatility of talent to write successfully for children than for grown persons. In the latter, one is privileged to assume native intelligence and cultivation, but the tender, untutored minds of the former permit no such margin, and this fact necessitates clearness and simplicity of style, and power of illustration that seem to me very rare. As yet, I am conscious of my incapacity for the mission of preparing juvenile books, but perhaps if I study closely the characteristics of young people, I shall learn to understand them more thoroughly. So much depends on the proper training of our American youth, especially in view of the great political questions that now agitate the country, that I confess I feel some anxiety on this subject. But, Edna, you will not adhere to your resolution of keeping silent. The public is a merciless taskmaster. Your own ambition will scourge you on, and having once put your hand to the literary plough, you will not be allowed to look back. Rigorously the world exacts the full quota of the author's aurora. Yes, sir, but he that plougheth should plough in hope, and when I can see clearly across the wide field, and drive the gleaming share of truth straight and steady to the end, then and not till then shall I render my summer day's aurora. Meantime I am resolved to plough no crooked, shallow furrows on the hearts of our people. At length, when Mr. Manning rose to say good night, he looked gravely at the governess, and asked, Edna, cannot Lila take the vacant place in your sad heart? It is not vacant, sir. Dear memories walk to and fro therein, weaving garlands of immortelles, singing sweet tunes of days and years that can never die. Hereafter I shall endeavor to entertain the precious guests I have already, and admit no more. The past is the realm of my heart, the present and future the kingdom where my mind must dwell and my hands labor. With a sigh he went away, and she took up the letters and began to read them. Many were from strangers, and they greatly cheered and encouraged her, but finally she opened one, whose superscription had until this instant escaped her cursory glance. It was from Mr. Hammond, and contained an account of Mr. Murray's ordination. She read and reread it, with a half-bewildered expression in her countenance, for the joy seemed far too great for credence. She looked again at the date and signature, and passing her hand over her brow, wondered if there could be any mistake. The paper fell into her lap, and a cry of delight rang through the room. Saved, purified, consecrated, henceforth to God's holy work, a minister of Christ. O most merciful God, I thank Thee. My prayers are answered with a blessing I never dared to hope for, or even to dream of. Can I ever be grateful enough? A pastor, holding up pure hands. Thank God, my sorrows are all ended now. There is no more grief for me. Ah, what a glory breaks upon the future! What though I never see his face in this world? I can be patient indeed, for now I know, oh, I know, that I shall surely see it yonder. She sank on her knees at the open window, and wept for the first time since Felix died. Happy, happy tears mingled with broken words of rejoicing that seemed a foretaste of heaven. Her heart was so full of gratitude and exultation that she could not sleep, and she sat down and looked over the sea while her face was radiant and tremulous. The transition from patient hopelessness and silent struggling, this most unexpected and glorious fruition of the prayers of many years, was so sudden and intoxicating that it completely unnerved her. She could not bear this great happiness as she had borne her sorrows, and now and then she smiled to find tears gushing afresh from her beaming eyes. Once in an hour of sinful madness, Mr. Murray had taken a human life, and ultimately caused the loss of another, but the waves that were running high beyond the mole told her in thunder tones that he had saved had snatched 2 lives from their devouring rage, and the shining stars overhead grouped themselves into characters that said to her, Judge not, that ye be not judged, and the ancient mountains whispered, Stand still and see the salvation of God, and the grateful soul of the lonely woman answered, that all the jarring notes of life seemed blending in a psalm, and all the angels of its strife slow rounding into calm. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of St. Elmo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org.
St. Elmo by Augusta Jane Evans. Chapter 37. Immediately after her return to New York, Edna resumed her studies with renewed energy, and found her physical strength recruited and her mind invigorated by repose. Her fondness for Hattie induced her to remain with Mrs. Andrews in the capacity of governess, though her position in the family had long ceased to resemble in any respect that of a hireling. 3 hours of each day were devoted to the education of the little girl, who, though vastly inferior in mental endowments to her brother, was an engaging and exceedingly affectionate child, fully worthy of the love which her gifted governess lavished upon her. The remainder of her time Edna divided between study, music, and an extensive correspondence, which daily increased. She visited little, having no leisure and less inclination to fritter away her morning in gossip and chit-chat, but she set apart one evening in each week for the reception of her numerous kind friends and of all strangers who desired to call upon her. These reunions were brilliant and delightful, and it was considered a privilege to be present at gatherings where eminent men and graceful, refined, cultivated Christian women assembled to discuss ethical and aesthetic topics which all educated Americans are deemed capable of comprehending. Edna's abhorrence of double entendre and of the fashionable sans souci style of conversation, which was tolerated by many who really disliked but had not nerve enough to frown it down, was not a secret to any one who read her writings or attended her receptions. Without obtruding her rigid views of true womanly delicacy and decorum upon any one, her deportment under all circumstances silently published her opinion of certain latitudinarian expressions prevalent in society. She saw that the growing tendency to free and easy manners and colloquial license was rapidly destroying all reverence for womanhood, was levelling the distinction between ladies' parlours and gentlemen's club-rooms, was placing the sexes on a platform of equality which was dangerous to feminine delicacy, that God-built bulwark of feminine purity and of national morality. That time-honoured maxim, honi soit qui mal y pense, she found had been distorted from its original and noble significance, and was now a mere convenient India-rubber cloak, stretched at will to cover and excuse allusions which no really modest woman could tolerate. Consequently, when she heard it flippantly pronounced in palliation of some gross offence against delicacy, she looked more searchingly into the characters of the indiscreet talkers, and quietly intimated to them that their presence was not desired at her receptions. Believing that modesty and purity were twin sisters, and that vulgarity and vice were rarely, if ever, divorced, Edna sternly refused to associate with those whose laxity of manners indexed in her estimation a corresponding laxity of morals. Married belles and married beaux she shunned and detested, regarding them as a disgrace to their families, as a blot upon all noble womanhood and manhood, and as the most dangerous foes to the morality of the community, in which they unblushingly violated hearthstone statutes and the venerable maxims of social decorum. The ostracized banded in wrath and ridiculed her antiquated prudery, but knowing that the pure and noble mothers, wives, and daughters honoured and trusted her, Edna gave no heed to raillery and envious malice, but resolutely obeyed the promptings of her womanly intuitions. Painful experience had taught her the imprudence, the short-sighted policy of working until very late at night, and in order to take due care of her health, she wisely resorted to a different system of study, which gave her more sleep and allowed her some hours of daylight for her
literary labours. In the industrial pursuits of her own sex she was intensely interested, and spared no trouble in acquainting herself with the statistics of those branches of employment already open to them. Consequently, she was never so happy as when the recipient of letters from the poor women of the land, who thanked her for the words of hope, advice, and encouragement which she constantly addressed to them. While the world honoured her, she had the precious assurance that her Christian countrymen loved and trusted her. She felt the painful need of Mr. Manning's society, and even his frequent letters did not fully satisfy her, but as he had resolved to remain in Europe, at least for some years, she bore the irreparable loss of his counsel and sympathy, as she bore all other privations, bravely and quietly. Now and then alarming symptoms of the old suffering warned her of the uncertainty of her life, and after much deliberation, feeling that her time was limited, she commenced another book. Mr. Hammond wrote, begging her to come to him, as he was now hopelessly infirm and confined to his room, but she shrank from a return to the village, so intimately associated with events which she wished, if possible, to forget, and though she declined the invitation, she proved her affection for her venerable teacher by sending him every day a long cheerful letter. Since her departure from the parsonage, Mrs. Murray had never written to her, but through Mr. Hammond's and Huldah's letters, Edna learned that Mr. Murray was the officiating minister in the church which he had built in his boyhood, and now and then the old pastor painted pictures of life at Le Bocage that brought happy tears to the orphan's eyes. She heard from time to time of the good the new minister was accomplishing among the poor, of the beneficial influence he exerted, especially over the young men of the community, of the charitable institutions to which he was devoting a large portion of his fortune, of the love and respect, the golden opinions he was winning from those whom he had formerly estranged by his sarcastic bitterness. While Edna fervently thanked God for this most wonderful change, she sometimes repeated exultingly, "Man-like is it to fall into sin, fiend-like is it to dwell therein. Christ-like is it for sin to grieve, God-like is it all sin to leave." One darling rose-hued dream of her life was to establish a free school and circulating library in the village of Chattanooga, and keeping this hope ever in view, she had denied herself all superfluous luxuries, and jealousy hoarded her savings. She felt now that, should she become an invalid, and incapable of writing or teaching, the money made by her books, which Mr. Andrews had invested very judiciously, would at least supply her with the necessities of life. One evening she held her weekly reception as usual, though she had complained of not feeling quite well that day. A number of carriages stood before Mrs. Andrews's door, and many friends, who laughed and talked to the governess, little dreamed that it was the last time they would spend an evening together in her society. The pleasant hours passed swiftly. Edna had never conversed more brilliantly, and the auditors thought her voice was richer and sweeter than ever, as she sang the last song and rose from the piano. The guests took their departure, the carriages rolled away. Mrs. Andrews ran up to her room, and Edna paused in the brilliantly lighted parlours to read a note which had been handed to her during the evening. Standing under the blazing chandelier, the face and figure of this woman could not fail to excite interest in all who gazed upon her. She was dressed in plain black silk, which exactly fitted her form, and in her hair glowed clusters of scarlet geranium flowers. A spray of red fuchsia was fastened by the beautiful stone cameo that confined her lace collar, and save the handsome gold bands on her wrists, she wore no other ornaments. Felix had given her these bracelets as a Christmas present, and after his death she never took them off, for inside he had his name and hers engraved, and between them the word Mizpah. Tonight the governess was very weary, and the fair, sweet face wore its old childish expression of mingled hopelessness and perfect patience and indescribable repose. As she read, the tired look passed away, and over her pallid features, so daintily sculptured, stole a faint glow, such as an ivory Niobe might borrow from the fluttering crimson folds of silken shroudings. The peaceful lips stirred also, and the low tone was full of pathos as she said, "How very grateful I ought to be, how much I have to make me happy, to encourage me to work diligently and faithfully. How comforting it is to feel that parents have sufficient confidence in me to be willing to commit their children to my care. What more can I wish? My cup is brimmed with blessings. Ah, why am I not entirely happy?" The note contained the signature of 6 wealthy gentlemen, who requested her acceptance of a tasteful and handsome house on condition that she would consent to undertake the education of their daughters, and permit them to pay her a liberal salary. It was a flattering tribute to the clearness of her intellect, the soundness of her judgment, the extent of her acquirements, and the purity of her heart. While she could not accede to the proposition, she appreciated most gratefully the generosity and good opinion of those who made it. Twisting the note between her fingers, her eyes fell on the carpet, and she thought of all her past, of the sorrows, struggles, and heartaches, the sleepless nights and weary, joyless days, first of adverse, then of favorable criticism, of toiling, hoping, dreading, praying, and now, in the peaceful zenith of her triumph, popularity, and usefulness, she realized that care and trial seem at last, through memory's sunset air, like mountain ranges overpast, in purple distance fair. The note fluttered to the floor, the hands folded themselves together, and she raised her eyes to utter an humble, fervent "Thank God!" But the words froze on her lips, for as she looked up, she saw Mr. Murray standing a few feet from her. "God has pardoned all my sins, and accepted me as a laborer worthy to enter his vineyard. Is Edna Earle more righteous than the Lord she worships?" His face was almost as pale as hers, and his voice trembled as he extended his arms toward her. She stood motionless, looking up at him with eyes that brightened until their joyful radiance seemed indeed unearthly, and the faint, delicate blush on her cheeks deepened and burned, as with a quivering cry of gladness that told volumes. She hid her face in her hands. He came nearer, and the sound of his low, mellow voice thrilled her heart as no other music had ever done. "Edna, have you a right to refuse me forgiveness when the blood of Christ has purified me from the guilt of other years?" She trembled and said brokenly, "Mr. Murray, you never wronged me, and I have nothing to forgive. Do you still believe me an unprincipled hypocrite? Oh, no, no, no! Do you believe that my repentance has been sincere and acceptable to my insulted God? Do you believe that I am now as faithfully endeavoring to serve him as a remorseful man possibly can?" "I hope so, Mr. Murray." "Edna, can you trust me now?" Some seconds elapsed before she answered, and then the words were scarcely audible. "I trust you. Thank God." There was a brief pause, and she heard a heavily drawn sigh escape him. "Edna, it is useless to tell you how devotedly I love you, for you have known that for years. And yet you have shown my love no mercy. But perhaps if you could realize how much I need your help in my holy work, how much more good I could accomplish in the world if you were with me, you might listen without steeling yourself against me, as you have so long done. Can you, will you, trust me fully? Can you be a minister's wife, and aid him as only you can? Oh, my darling, my darling! I never expect to be worthy of you, but you can make me less unworthy. My own darling, come to me." He stood within 2 feet of her, but he was too humble? Nay, nay, too proud to touch her without permission. Her hands fell from her crimson cheeks, and she looked up at the countenance of her king. In her fond eyes he seemed noble and sanctified and worthy of all confidence, and as he opened his arms once more, she glided into them, and laid her head on his shoulder, whispering, "Oh, I trust you fully." Standing in the close, tender clasp of his strong arms, she listened to a narration of his grief and loneliness, his hopes and fears, his desolation and struggles and prayers during their long separation. Then for the first time she learned that he had come more than once to New York, solely to see her, having exacted a promise from Mr. Manning that he would not betray his presence in the city. He had followed her at a distance as she wandered with the children through the park, and once in the ramble stood so close to her that he put out his hand and touched her dress. Mr. Manning had acquainted him with all that had ever passed between them on the subject of his unsuccessful suit, and during her sojourn in Europe had kept him regularly advised of the state of her health. At last, when Mr. Murray bent his head to press his lips again to hers, he exclaimed in the old pleading tone that had haunted her memory for years, "Edna, with all your meekness, you are wilfully proud. You tell me you trust me, and you nestle your dear head here on my shoulder. Why won't you say what you know so well I am longing, hungering to hear? Why won't you say, 'Saint Elmo, I love you'?" The glowing face was only pressed closer. "My little darling. Oh, Mr. Murray, could I be here? Well, my stately Miss Earle, I am waiting most respectfully to allow you an opportunity of expressing yourself." No answer. He laughed, as she had heard him once before when he took her in his arms and dared her to look into his eyes. "When I heard your books extolled, when I heard your praises from men, women, and children, when I could scarcely pick up a paper without finding some mention of your name, when I came here tonight and paced the pavement, waiting for your admirers to leave the house, whenever and wherever I've heard your dear name uttered, I've been exultingly proud, for I knew that the heart of the people's pet was mine. I gloried in the consciousness, which alone strengthened and comforted me, that despite all that the public could offer you, despite the adulation of other men, and despite my utter unworthiness, my own darling was true to me, that you never loved any one but Saint Elmo Murray. And as God reigns above us, his happy world holds no man so grateful, so happy, so proud as I am, no man so resolved to prove himself worthy of his treasure. Edna, looking back across the dark years that have gone so heavily over my head, and comparing you, my pure, precious darling, with that woman whom in my boyhood I selected for my life companion, I know not whether I am most humble or grateful or proud. Ah, who am I, that God hath saved me from the doom I did desire, and crossed the lot myself had craved to set me higher? What have I done that he should bow from heaven to choose a wife for me, and what deserved he should endow my home with thee? As Mr. Hammond was not able to take the fatiguing journey north, and Edna would not permit anyone else to perform her marriage ceremony, she sent Mr. Murray home without her, promising to come to the parsonage as early as possible. Mr. and Mrs. Andrews were deeply pained by the intelligence of her approaching departure, and finally consented to accompany her on her journey. The last day of the orphan's sojourn in New York was spent at the quiet spot where Felix slept his last sleep, and it caused her keen grief to bid good-bye to his resting place, which was almost as dear to her as the grave of her grandfather. Their affection had been so warm, so sacred, that she clung fondly to his memory, and it was not until she reached the old village depot, where carriages were waiting for the party, that the shadow of that day entirely left her countenance. In accordance with her own request, Edna did not see Mr. Murray again until the hour appointed for their marriage. It was a bright, beautiful afternoon, warm with sunshine, when she permitted Mrs. Murray to lead her into the study where the party had assembled. Mr. and Mrs. Andrews, Hattie, Huldah, and the white-haired pastor were all there, and when Edna entered, Mr. Murray advanced to meet her and received her hand from his mother. The orphan's eyes were bent on the floor, and never once lifted, even when the trembling voice of her beloved pastor pronounced her Saint Elmo Murray's wife. The intense pallor of her face frightened Mrs. Andrews, who watched her with suspended breath, and once moved eagerly toward her. Mr. Murray felt her lean more heavily against him during the ceremony, and now turning to take her in his arms, he saw that her eyelashes had fallen on her cheeks. She had lost all consciousness of what was passing. 2 hours elapsed before she recovered fully from the attack, and when the blood showed itself again in lips that were kissed so repeatedly, Mr. Murray lifted her from the sofa in the study, and passing his arm around her, said, "Today I snap the fetters of your literary bondage. There shall be no more books written, no more study, no more toil, no more anxiety, no more heartaches. And that dear public you love so well must even help itself, and whistle for a new pet. You belong solely to me now, and I shall take care of the life you have nearly destroyed in your inordinate ambition. Come, the fresh air will revive you." They stood a moment under the honeysuckle arch over the parsonage gate, where the carriage was waiting to take them to Le Bocage, and Mr. Murray asked, "Are you strong enough to go to the church?" "Yes, sir. The pain has all passed away. I am perfectly well again." They crossed the street, and he took her in his arms and carried her up the steps and into the grand, solemn church, where the soft, holy, violet light from the richly tinted glass streamed over gilded organ pipes and sculptured columns. Neither Edna nor St. Elmo spoke as they walked down the aisle, and in perfect silence both knelt before the shining altar, and only God heard their prayers of gratitude. After some moments, Mr. Murray put out his hand, took Edna's, and holding it in his on the balustrade, he prayed aloud, asking God's blessing on their marriage, and fervently dedicating all their future to his work. The hectic flush of the dying day was reflected on the window high above the altar, and burning through the red mantle of the Christ, fell down upon the marble shrine like sacred sacrificial fire. Edna felt as if her heart could not hold all its measureless joy. It seemed a delightful dream to see Mr. Murray kneeling at her side, to hear his voice earnestly consecrating their lives to the service of Jesus Christ. She knew from the tremor in his tone and the tears in his eyes that his dedication was complete, and now to be his companion through all the remaining years of their earthly pilgrimage, to be allowed to help him and love him, to walk heavenward with her hand in his, this was the crowning glory and richest blessing of her life. When his prayer ended, she laid her head down on the altar railing and sobbed like a child. In the orange glow of a wintry sunset they came out and sat down on the steps, while a pair of spotless white pigeons perched on the blood-stain, and Mr. Murray put his arm around Edna and drew her face to his bosom. "Darling, do you remember that once in the dark days of my reckless sinfulness, I asked you one night in the library at Le Bocage if you had no faith in me, and you repeated so vehemently, 'None, Mr. Murray.' Oh, sir, do not think of it. Why recur to what is so painful and so long past? Forgive those words and forget them. Never was more implicit faith, more devoted affection given to any human being than I give now to you, Mr. Murray, you who are my first and my last and my only love." She felt his arm tighten around her waist as he bowed his face to hers. "Forgive? Ah, my darling, do you recollect also that I told you then that the time would come when your dear lips would ask pardon for what they uttered that night, and that when that hour arrived I would take my revenge? My wife, my pure, noble, beautiful wife, give me my revenge. For I cry with the long-banished Roman, oh, a kiss, long as my exile, sweet as my revenge." He put his hand under her chin, drew the lips to his, and kissed them repeatedly. Down among the graves in the brown grass and withered leaves, behind a tall shaft, around which coiled a carved marble serpent with hooded head, there, amid the dead, crouched a woman's figure, with a stony face and blue, chatoyant eyes that glared with murderous hate at the sweet countenance of the happy bride. When St. Elmo tenderly kissed the pure lips of his wife, Agnes Powell smothered a savage cry, and Nemesis was satisfied as the wretched woman fell forward on the grass, sweeping her yellow hair over her eyes to shut out the vision that maddened her. Then and there, for the first time, as she sat enfolded by her husband's arm, Edna felt that she could thank him for the monument erected over her grandfather's grave. The light faded slowly in the west. The pigeons ceased their fluttering about the belfry, and as he turned to quit the church, so dear to both, Mr. Murray stretched his hand toward the ivy-clad vault, and said solemnly, "I throw all mournful years behind me, and by the grace of God, our new lives, commencing this hallowed day, shall make noble amends for the wasted past, loving each other, aiding each other, serving Christ, through whose atonement alone I have been saved from eternal ruin. To thy merciful guidance, O Father, we commit our future." Edna looked reverently up at his beaming countenance, whence the shadows of hate and scorn had long since passed, and as his splendid eyes came back to hers, reading in her beautiful, pure face all her love and confidence and happy hope, he drew her closer to his bosom, and laid his dark cheek on hers, saying fondly and proudly, "My wife, my life, oh, we will walk this world yoked in all exercise of noble end, and so through those dark gates across the wild that no man knows. My hopes and thine are one. Accomplish thou my manhood, and thyself lay thy sweet hands in mine, and trust to me." End of chapter 37. End of St. Elmo by Augusta J. Evans.